The morning Silas Crowther walked onto Lenora Vance's land. He didn't knock. He didn't call ahead. He just drove his black lacquered wagon straight through her gate like he already owned the place, because in his mind he already did. He stepped down slowly, smoothed his jacket, looked out across White Basin with those flat gray eyes, and said, loud enough for the three ranchers watching from the road to hear, "Shame what happens when a woman tries to do a man's job." He was holding a contract worth more money than Lenora had seen in her entire life, and he expected her to sign it without reading past the first page. She was 27 years old. She was heavyset, sunburned, and her hands were still rough from digging. She had 38 cents left to her name, and she had 26 cattle that had just saved an entire valley from dying of thirst. What would you have done? If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because the stories we tell on this channel are the ones they never put in history books. Real courage, real betrayal, real people who refuse to break when everything said they should. And if you've been with us for a while, drop your city or your country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The bankman's name was Gerald Pruett, and he had a habit of arriving right after breakfast, when people were still soft from sleep and hadn't yet hardened themselves for the day. He came on a Tuesday in early April, driving a clean buggy down the rutted track that led to the Vance property, and he sat across the kitchen table from Lenora with his ledger open and his pen already uncapped, as though the conversation they were about to have was merely a formality, a signature she would eventually provide once she accepted what was obvious to everyone else. "Miss Vance," he said, lacing his fingers together on top of the ledger, "the bank has been more than patient." Lenora was standing at the stove. She didn't sit down. She kept her back to him for a moment longer than was strictly polite, stirring a pot of oat porridge she wasn't hungry for, buying herself a few seconds to breathe before she turned around. "Patient," she repeated. Just the word, held up to the light. Pruett shifted in his chair. He was a small man with very clean fingernails, and Lenora had noticed years ago that men with very clean fingernails rarely did work that left marks on them. The productive acreage, the east sections, the creek frontage, those were taken in settlement of the debt. That's done. But the bank has held off on White Basin because we believed you might make something of it. He paused. We no longer believe that. Lenora turned around then. She was a large woman, big-boned, solid through the shoulders, with a round face that people sometimes mistook for softness until they looked at her eyes. She wore her father's old work shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow. There was a bruise along her left forearm from hauling fencing posts the previous afternoon. She hadn't slept more than 4 hours. "What do you believe now?" she asked. Pruett cleared his throat. "The bank is prepared to offer $110 for the remaining acreage. That is a generous figure, Miss Vance, given that White Basin produces nothing. The soil is alkaline. There's no reliable water. No one in this valley would pay half that sum for the land on its own merits." He slid a sheet of paper across the table. "This is a fair conclusion to a difficult situation." Lenora looked at the paper. She didn't touch it. She had been hearing words like fair conclusion and difficult situation for 8 months, ever since her father, Walt Vance, had died of a burst appendix in August, with debts that were larger than anyone in the family had known about. The loans had been taken out quietly, the way men of his generation handled shame, with a handshake and a silence that lasted until there was nothing left to shake hands over. When the lawyers had finally laid everything out on that same kitchen table, Lenora had understood two things simultaneously. Her father had been drowning for years and hadn't told her, and she was now the one left to stand on the wreckage. 27 years old, and she had a dead father, a seized East Ranch, and 450 acres of pale alkaline flats that the entire valley called worthless. "I'll think about it," she told Pruett. He blinked. That was not the answer he had come for. "Miss Vance, I said I'll think about it." She picked up the paper, folded it once, and set it on the shelf above the stove with the kind of quiet finality that ended conversations. "You'll have an answer by the end of the month." Pruett left. She heard his clean buggy wheels crunching back down the track, and she stood at the kitchen window and watched it go. And then she sat down at the table and pressed both palms flat against the wood and breathed. $110. She had $42 in the tin box beneath her cot. She had been trying for 8 months to make something grow in White Basin. She'd hauled water from the creek on the eastern boundary before the bank took that land too. She'd tried hay on the northern slope where the alkaline crust was thinner. Nothing had caught. The soil was the color of old ash, pale and powdery on top, dense and hostile underneath. And when the summer wind moved across it, it left a fine white residue on everything on the fence posts, on the barn window, on the back of Lenora's neck. People in Red Hollow Valley had a name for it. They called it the dead stretch. Some of the older ranchers said Walt Vance had been foolish to hold on to it even before the debts came. A few of the crueler ones said Lenora was holding on to it because she was too stubborn to be smart or too simple to know the difference. She heard things. Small towns have thin walls and loud mouths, and Lenora made regular trips into Red Hollow for supplies, so she heard things whether she wanted to or not. At Holt's feed store, girls going to starve herself proving a point. Outside the post office, two rancher wives who went quiet when Lenora came around the corner, but not quite quiet enough. Bless her heart, she just doesn't know when to give up. And once, from a table inside the Red Hollow Tavern, as she passed the open door on a hot afternoon, a man's voice she recognized as belonging to Dale Custer, who ran 300 head on the valley's best creek land, big woman, small brain, always the way. She kept walking. She always kept walking. But she heard it, and it sat in her chest like a stone that she carried everywhere, that got heavier on the days when the soil refused her, and the money shrank, and the bank letters arrived with their careful, bloodless language about outstanding obligations and remediation timelines. She was not a woman who cried easily, but there were nights that spring when she lay on her cot in the dark and let herself feel the full weight of what she was up against, and those nights were very long. The cattle appeared on a Wednesday morning, 12 days after Pruett's visit. Lenora was mending a stretch of fence along the property's south line when she heard them a slow, sorry sound, low and exhausted, coming from the road. She straightened up and looked. A man was driving a cart with a broken wheel, repaired badly with wire, and behind him, on leads and walking loose, came 26 cattle that looked like the idea of cattle rather than the real thing. Their ribs pressed out against their hides, like fingers pushing through cloth. Their heads hung low. One of them, a young heifer near the back, was walking with a slight list to one side, the way animals walk when they've decided, the ground is not worth trusting. The man driving the cart had a face that looked like it had been left out in the weather too long. He stopped when he saw Lenora. "You the Vance woman?" She pushed her hat back. "I am. Heard you might be buying cattle." Lenora had not heard this about herself, but she didn't say so. She looked at the animals. What happened to them? The man he gave his name as Purdy, just the one name, said he'd bought the herd off a ranch in the next county that had folded. The cattle had been badly managed for 2 seasons, underfed, poorly watered, moved too often without enough recovery time. Most of the buyers he'd approached had taken one look and passed. He'd been on the road with them for 6 days. He needed to sell. Lenora walked along the line of animals slowly. She looked at their eyes, their hooves, their teeth when she could get close enough. She knew cattle. Her father had taught her before she could read, and whatever else, Walt Vance had been secretive, proud, financially reckless. He had known livestock with a bone-deep accuracy that Lenora had absorbed without realizing it. These animals were starving. But they were not, she thought, beyond saving. "What are you asking?" she said. Purdy named a figure. Lenora countered. They went back and forth 3 times, and when it was done, she had agreed to pay $36 for all 26 cattle, which left her exactly $6 in the tin box beneath her cot. She knew, even as she said the number out loud and watched Purdy nod, that this was either the bravest thing she had ever done or the most catastrophically stupid. She could not tell which. She suspected she might not know for a long time. Soren Halwick appeared that same afternoon, as he often did, materializing from the direction of his property to the northeast, with no particular announcement and a general air of having been headed somewhere else, until he wasn't. He was 71 years old and had ranched the valley longer than most of its current residents had been alive. He was lean in the way that old work makes men lean, not frail, but reduced to essentials, nothing left that wasn't load-bearing. He stood at the fence and looked at the 26 cattle in Lenora's holding pen. He was quiet for a long time. "Purdy sell you these." he asked finally. You know him? Know of him. Soren took off his hat and resettled it, a gesture that meant he was thinking. These are the Aberdale cattle. That ranch went under last fall. Lenora said nothing. She was watching the cattle, who were too tired to do much, except stand and breathe. People sentenced to say things, Soren said. People already say things. He looked at her sideways. There was something in the look that was not pity she had learned, to recognize pity's exact shape, and this wasn't it. It was something closer to assessment. He was deciding whether she knew what she'd done. You have feed for them? Enough hay for 3 weeks if I stretch it. I'll haul water from the north boundary until I can figure something better. That's a lot of hauling. Yes, she agreed. Soren put his hat back on. I've got a section of hay I won't need until fall. You can have it. Lenora looked at him. In 8 months of struggling alone, almost no one in the valley had offered her anything without a price attached or a judgment wrapped around it. The simpleness of what he'd just said, you can have it, hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. Thank you, she said, and she meant it in a way that was bigger than the words. Soritz nodded once, as though the matter was settled, and began walking back toward his property. He'd gone about 30 yards when he stopped and half-turned. Those cattle, he said, watch where they go. Lenora frowned. What do you mean? But Soren had already turned away again, and he didn't explain himself further, and she didn't know yet what he meant, and the 26 cattle stood in the pen behind her in the afternoon light, breathing slowly, alive and barely. The next 2 weeks were the hardest she could remember, and she had a long catalog of hard things to compare them to. She was up before dawn every day. She hauled water in barrels loaded onto the old cart, driving the route to the north boundary and back twice each morning before the heat rose. She spread hay in careful portions, not enough to satisfy, but enough to sustain, and she watched the cattle eat with the desperate, focused attention of animals that had spent a long time not eating enough. She checked their feet and their eyes. She talked to them not because she believed they understood her, but because silence in those pre-dawn hours was heavier than she wanted to carry alone. Her palms blistered and healed and blistered again. She lost 4 pounds in 2 weeks, which on her large frame was barely visible, but which she felt in her joints and in the particular deepness of her exhaustion at night. Town talked. She knew because Soren's granddaughter, a sharp-eyed girl of 16 named Fern, who occasionally brought Lenora supplies from town as a favor to her grandfather, reported what she heard with the frank relentlessness of a young person who has not yet learned to soften bad news. Mr. Custer says you'll be bankrupt by June, Fern reported one morning, handing over a sack of dried beans. Mr. Custer has been predicting my bankruptcy for 8 months, Lenora said. He's also saying that a woman your size couldn't manage a real herd even if the cattle were already dead. Fern said it without inflection, the way she might report weather. He said that at Holt's in front of 5 other men. Lenora took the beans. What did the 5 other men say? Fern's mouth pressed into a thin line. They laughed. The stone in Lenora's chest got a little heavier. She thanked Fern for the beans and said nothing else about it because there was nothing useful to say, and because she had learned that the only answer to men like Dale Custer was the kind that didn't use words. But she lay awake that night longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, doing the arithmetic that she always did in those quiet hours, the money against the time, against what she could reasonably hope for, and the numbers did not add up. They had not been adding up for months. She knew that. She went over it again anyway, the way a person prods a bruise to see if it still hurts, to see if they've gotten any better at bearing it. It always still hurt. 15 days after Purdy delivered the cattle, Lenora noticed what Soren had meant. It happened in the mid-morning, when she had let the animals out of the holding pen to graze on what little the north slope offered. She was watching them from the fence line, a half-inch she developed, watching them the way her father had taught her, looking for changes in posture and movement that signaled health or trouble when she saw it. They were drifting. All of them, not in the chaotic scatter of cattle released from a small space, but with a strange collective intention, moving south and then southwest, down the gradual slope toward the center of White Basin. She watched. They came to rest in a cluster on a patch of ground near the basin's lowest point, a stretch of pale, cracked alkaline flat that looked identical to everything around it. And then the animal in front, a broad-chested steer who had recovered the fastest of all of them, lowered his head, and began to paw at the ground. Then the one beside him. Then another. All 26 of them, pawing at the same useless stretch of dead white earth. Lenora stood at the fence with her hand on the top rail and felt something she had felt in a very long time, a thing she couldn't quite name, somewhere between terror and hope, the feeling of standing at the edge of something whose bottom she could not yet see. She drove them back to the pen. They went reluctantly, looking back over their shoulders. The next morning she let them out again. She watched. They went straight back to the same spot. She walked out to where they'd been pawing. She knelt down and pressed her palm against the ground. Felt like every other patch of white basin, packed, dry, indifferent. She drove them back again. On the third day, instead of driving them back, she went to find Soren, came with her to the basin that afternoon, and he walked out to the spot the cattle favored, and he crouched down with the deliberate care of a man who has learned not to trust his knees, and he pressed both hands flat against the pale crust. He stayed like that for a moment. Then he said, "Feel the temperature." Lenora knelt beside him and pressed her hand down. The ground around them was hot, genuinely hot, the stored heat of weeks of sun on bare, alkaline flat, the kind of heat that stings through boot leather by midday. But here, directly under her palm, in this particular spot, it was cooler. Not dramatically, not cold, but unmistakably different. And the crust under her hand had a faint give to it, a barely perceptible yielding, like pressing on the skin of something that breathed. She looked at Soren. His expression was careful, and she recognized that carefulness as the look of someone who thinks they know what they're seeing, but doesn't want to say it yet in case they're wrong. Because the gap between what this might mean and what this would mean, if it was real, was a gap she would feel very badly if she fell into it. "What is this?" she asked. Soren looked at the patch of ground. Cattle were grouped at the edge of it, watching both of them with the patient, uncurious attention of animals that have already delivered their information and are waiting for the slower creatures to catch up. "It might be nothing," Soren said, but he was quiet for a beat. "But I've seen something like this once before. A long time ago. A ranch in the Eastern Territory when I was young." He paused. They dug and they found water. The word landed between them, and they both looked at the ground, and neither spoke for a moment. "Artesian," Soren said quietly, "trapped water, under pressure, looking for the lowest point in the rock to escape through." Lenora looked at the basin around her, the flat, pale, dead-looking stretch of land that everyone had told her was worthless, that she had been trying to give some value to for 8 months, that the bank wanted to buy for $110 and probably sell to someone else for much more once they figured out what was under it. She looked at her 26 cattle, standing at the edge of the cool patch, having walked to it 3 days in a row, with a directness that didn't require explanation. She looked at her hands. Then she stood up and said, "I'm going to need my father's spade." Lenora retrieved the spade from herself. She didn't ask Soren to wait while she went for it, and she didn't explain what she was planning to do beyond what she'd already said. She just walked across the basin with the long-handled spade over her shoulder, her boots raising small puffs of white dust with each step, and when she reached the cool patch, she planted her feet and drove the blade into the ground. The first few inches were hard. The alkaline crust had the density of something that had never been disturbed, packed down by seasons of heat and no rain and no roots reaching into it, and the spade rang against it with a sound that was closer to hitting stone, the soil. Lenora worked it anyway. She chopped and pried and turned, her shoulders rolling into each sweat, appearing on her forehead within the first 3 minutes. Soren stood back and watched without offering to help, which she recognized as a form of respect. He understood that she needed to be the one doing this, that this particular act of digging was not something she could delegate and still own. The 26 cattle had drifted back toward the spot. They arranged themselves in a loose half-circle at what seemed to be a respectful distance, far enough not to interfere, close enough that Lenora could hear them breathing. By the time she was 18 inches down, the soil had changed. Pale alkaline crust had given way to something darker, a reddish-brown subsoil that was denser and heavier and clung to the spade blade in clumps rather than crumbling. She had to work harder to pull each load out, and she could feel the strain moving from her shoulders into her lower back. The familiar deep ache of heavy labor sustained past the point of comfort. "You should rest," Soren said. I'll rest when there's a reason to, she said, and kept digging. She wasn't being stubborn for the sake of it. She was operating on something that didn't have a clean name, not quite hope, because hope implied optimism, and she'd beaten most of her optimism into a more durable shape over the past 8 months. It was something more like refusal. A refusal to stop before she had information. A refusal to accept the ground's verdict before she had gone deep enough to hear what the ground was actually saying. At 2 feet, the soil was damp. Not wet damp. The way soil gets when it has been holding moisture for a long time in the dark. When Lenora pressed her thumb against a clump of it, it left a mark. She looked at the mark for a moment. Then she looked at Soren. He was already looking at her. Neither of them said anything. Kept digging. At 3 feet, the wall of the hole was visibly wet. Water was seeping through the reddish subsoil in thin, dark threads, moving toward the lowest point of the hole and collecting there, slowly, patient determination of water that has been traveling underground for a very long time and is not in any particular hurry, because it has nowhere else to be. Latora stopped digging. She stood in the hole up to her thighs and looked down at the gathering water and felt something break open in her chest that she was not prepared for. It wasn't the dramatic relief of a person who has just been rescued. It was quieter than that, and stranger, more like the feeling of setting down a weight you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten it was there, and only knew it was gone by the sudden absence of the ache. She put both hands on the rim of the hole and pushed herself out. She sat beside it, and she didn't speak, and Soren came and crouched beside her, and they both watched the water level slowly rise in the hole. Artesian? Soren said again. The same word as before, but different now. Before it had been a theory. Now it was a name for a real thing. How much? Lenora asked. Hard to say until it has room to move. He tilted his head, studying the rate of rise. But the pressure's there, you can tell, by how fast it's finding the bottom of your hole. That water's not seeping down from surface rain. It's coming up. She looked at the basin around her. All those flat, pale, dead-looking acres she'd been told were worthless. She thought about the bank offer $110. She thought about Pruitt's clean fingernails and his uncapped pen. This is what I think it is, she said carefully. How much water are we talking about? Soren was quiet for a moment. A careful man. If it's a real artesian source, if the aquifer beneath this basin is what I think it might be, he stopped. You could be sitting over enough water to supply this entire valley through a dry summer. The words sat in the air between them, and Lenora let them settle before she touched them, because she'd learned the hard way that rushing at good news was as dangerous as running from bad. Nobody else knows, she said. Not a question. A statement she was checking. Nobody's dug, Soren said. Why would they? The land's supposed to be worthless. Lenora looked at her hands. The palms were bleeding slightly where the blisters had reopened against the spade handle. She pressed them against her trouser legs and felt the sting of it, which was a real and useful feeling, grounding, evidence that this was actually happening, and not the kind of desperate fantasy that visited you in the small hours of the night when the numbers didn't add up. We don't tell anyone, she said. Soren nodded slowly. Not yet. Not until we know what we have. Agreed. She stood up, picked up the spade, and went back to work. What followed were 3 weeks that Lenora would spend the rest of her life being unable to fully explain to anyone who hadn't been there. She and Soren worked the spring in the early mornings and the late evenings when the basin was in shadow and the chance of being observed from the road was lowest. They widened the initial hole methodically, shoring up its walls with boards salvaged from a collapsed section of the old outbuilding, working by lantern light, when the sky darkened to amber and then to black. The water rose steadily. Not in a dramatic rush, this was not a geyser, not a sudden spectacular eruption from the earth. It was quieter and more reliable than that. It pressed upward at a constant rate, clear and cold and faintly mineral-smelling, filling the expanded excavation until it overflowed the edges and began moving, tracing the natural slope of the basin toward the south, finding the lowest points and moving toward them the way. Water always moves not with force, but with a kind of tireless patience that is, in its own way, more powerful than force. Lenora built a retaining wall on the 3rd day, using stones she hauled from the rocky outcrops on the basin's western edge. Her back screamed at her constantly. She carried the stones in a wheelbarrow over ground that was uneven enough to make every load a negotiation between the wheelbarrow and gravity, and she lost several loads when the wheel found ruts she hadn't anticipated, and she stood in the spilled stones and breathed and then loaded them back up and kept going. Soren dug the first channel with her, a shallow trench angling southwest toward a natural depression that would, they calculated, hold water well enough to serve as a stock pond. He was 71 years old, and he worked with the economy of motion that very experienced people develop, not wasting effort on dramatic gestures, not hurrying, not stopping unless he had to, just steady and continuous, the way a creek moves. Lenora watched him sometimes and thought about what it must take to still be out here at 71, still putting your back into it, still choosing to use whatever you had left on someone else's problem. She didn't ask him why. It seemed like the wrong question, the kind of question that would make him feel watched, in a way he hadn't signed up for. But one evening, when they were sitting on the basin rim eating the cold cornbread she'd brought in a cloth, she said, "You didn't have to do any of this." Soren chewed his cornbread. "No," he agreed. "I mean it. You've given me hay, time, labor. I can't pay you back right now, and I don't know when I could." He was quiet for a moment. "My wife died 6 years ago," he said. "Before that, when things were hard, and things were hard, plenty people helped us. I don't mean they gave speeches about it. I mean they showed up with hay, and they helped dig channels, and they didn't make you feel small for needing it." He brushed crumbs off his knee. "I'm old enough that I don't have a lot of things left to do with whatever time and strength I have. Seems like this is worth spending it on." Lenora looked out at the basin, at the growing pool of water, catching the last orange light of the evening, and she didn't say anything, because she'd found that some things shrink when you try to put them into words. Her cattle drank from the pond for the first time on the 6th day. They walked into it with a patience that she found almost ceremonial single file, each animal stepping to the water's edge and lowering its head with a care that seemed wrong, for creatures that had been so badly deprived. She had expected chaos. Instead, they were quiet, orderly, drinking long and slow, and when the last of them had finished and lifted its head, water dripping from its muzzle, Lenora had the strange and irreversible sensation of knowing that something had changed, not just the water level in a hole in the ground, but something about her own position in the valley, though she couldn't yet see its shape clearly enough to name it. The first sign that the summer was going to be savage came in late May, when the creek on Custer's property dropped a full foot in 2 weeks, without any corresponding dry spell to explain it. Then the Holt brothers reported their secondary well-producing cloudy water, which meant the torque table was falling faster than the recharge rate could compensate. Soren watched the sky for 3 days and said quietly that he didn't think the rains were coming when they should. He was right. By the middle of June, the rains were 4 weeks late. By the end of June, the creek that crossed Custer's east pasture was a series of shallow pools connected by mud. By the first week of July, several of those pools had dried entirely, leaving behind dark stains in the creek bed that looked like old wounds. Lenora, watching from across White Basin, felt something she was not proud of: a cold, small satisfaction that she recognized immediately and pushed down because she was not that kind of person and she refused to become one. It was not that she wanted Custer to suffer. She didn't. But after 8 months of being told she was too fat and too female and too stupid to rancher this land, after 100 small moments of being laughed at and looked through and spoken about as though she were standing somewhere else, there was a piece of her that noted the drought's arrival with a quiet, terrible sense of proportion. She did not act on it. She went back to work. By that point, the stock pond held more water than she had imagined possible. The artesian source was flowing at a rate that had surprised even Soren, who revised his estimate upward 3 times over the 6 weeks they'd been developing it. The channels they dug extended the water's reach across the basin's lower sections, and in those sections, to Lenora's genuine bewilderment, things were beginning to grow. Not much, not lush, productive pasture, but thin, tough grass was pushing through the alkaline crust in the areas closest to the channels, and the cattle were finding it and eating it, and they were healthy. Not just surviving, genuinely healthy, solid through the shoulders and hindquarters, moving with the easy, Both were dark, unhurried energy of animals that are eating enough and drinking enough and have stopped calculating their own reserves against the time remaining. She stood at the basin's edge one morning and looked at her herd and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, not happiness exactly, which seemed too lightweight for the circumstance, but a deep structural sense of rightness, like a wall that has been braced properly, finally bearing weight without complaint. Then Fern arrived on her horse with her eyes wide and her hat slightly crooked from riding fast. "People know," she said before she'd fully dismounted. Lenora went still. "What people?" "Tobin Marsh was out here yesterday, helping you with the channels." His mother asked him why he smelled like mud, and he told her. Fern pressed her lips together. "I'm sorry, he's 12. He didn't understand." Lenora closed her eyes for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, she ran a rapid calculation. How much time she had, what it would mean, what her options were. She opened her eyes. How many people know right now? His mother. Probably his father by now. "You know how fast things move." "Fast," Lenora agreed. "What are you going to do?" Lenora looked out at the basin, at the water, at the cattle. The pale alkaline flat that was, in small and stubborn ways, becoming something other than what everyone had always said it was. She thought about Soren saying, "Seems like this is worth spending it on." She thought about her father's debts and the clean-nailed bankman and $110. She thought about Dale Custer's voice through the tavern door. "I'm going to do the thing nobody expects," she said. Tobin Marsh was, as Fern had said, 12 years old. He was also, and this mattered, not malicious. He was a boy who had helped Lenora haul stone and dig channels for 2 weeks because he was curious and restless and willing to work, and who had told his mother about the water the way children tell things, not strategically, just because it was the most interesting thing that had happened to him recently, and he wanted to share it. Lenora rode to the Marsh property the following morning. Tobin's father, Ray Marsh, met her at the gate with the cautious expression of a man who is not sure whether he is about to be asked for something or accused of something. He was a mid-sized rancher, neither the richest nor the poorest in the valley, and he had not been among the men who'd mocked Lenora directly, but he'd been present at enough conversations where it happened without objecting to it. "Miss Vance," he said, "Mr. Marsh." She dismounted. "I know what Tobin told you. I want you to hear the rest of it from me before you hear a version of it from someone else." Marsh's eyebrows moved slightly. That was not the opening he'd expected. She told him the truth, all of it. The cattle, the digging, the artesian source, the pond, the flow rate. She showed him the numbers she'd been keeping in a notebook, her own rough calculations of capacities and sustainability. She told him about the channels and the retaining wall and what Soren had said about the drought. Marsh listened without interrupting, which she respected. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He looked past her, toward the south, in the direction of White Basin, as though he could see through the distance to the water she'd described. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. "Nothing," she said. "I wanted you to hear the truth before the rumors got to it. And I want you to understand that what I'm about to do, I'm doing because it's the right thing, not because I owe anyone in this valley anything." He looked at her. "I'm opening the basin," she said. "Anyone who needs to water their cattle can bring them to White Basin. I'll charge a maintenance fee enough to cover the ongoing work of keeping the channels and the pond functional. That's it. No gouging, no exclusions." Marsh stared at her for a long beat. "You do that, after what people have said about you." Lenora looked at him steadily. "What people have said about me isn't a reason to let cattle die." He looked away first. She watched something move across his face, something that was not quite shame, but in the same neighborhood. "Spread the word," he said finally. "Please do," she said. And she remounted and rode back toward White Basin. The first ranchers arrived 3 days later cautiously, the way animals approach something unfamiliar, testing the air before committing. There were 4 of them, including Ray Marsh and an older man named Beaumont, who ran sheep on the valley's eastern slope. They came at dawn, when the light was still soft, as though they'd agreed without saying, so that this whole thing required less scrutiny than it would get at midday. Lenora met them at the basin's edge. She could see them taking it in the pond that shouldn't be there, the green edges of it, the channels cutting across what they had all believed to be dead ground. She watched their faces and saw the specific expression that frets a person's face when what they are seeing is genuinely incompatible with what they were sure they knew. It was not entirely comfortable to witness, even for her. Beaumont was the first one to speak. He was a weathered man in his 60s, unhurried and direct. "How long has this been here?" he asked. "I found it 6 weeks ago," Lenora said. "Cattle led me to it." He looked at her herd, grazing on the thin pasture near the channels. "Purdy cattle." "That's right." He was quiet for a moment. "Those were the ones everyone thought were dying." "They were dying," she said simply, and then they weren't. Another pause. She could see him working through something. "How much water is there?" "Enough for this valley through a bad summer, if people are careful with it." She had made Soren give her his best honest estimate, and she'd pushed him for precision, and she was using his numbers now rather than her own because she trusted his more than hers. "The source isn't going to run out because of what I've developed on top of it. That's artesian, the pressure comes from below. It's a separate system." Beaumont nodded slowly, like a man accepting a fact he hadn't asked for but couldn't refute. "The maintenance fee," said one of the others, a younger rancher named Aldrich, who had a sharp, measuring face. "What's it cover?" Lenora laid it out plainly. "Cost of keeping the channels clear, repairing the retaining wall after weather damage, maintaining the access into the basin so that cattle could be brought in without churning the channels into mud." She'd calculated it carefully, not to be generous, but to be fair enough to sustain the operation, not enough to enrich her. Aldrich did the arithmetic in his head. She could see him doing it. He paused. "That's less than I'd pay for a day's water at the trading post." "Yes," she said. "Why?" he asked. And he asked it with a genuine bluntness, not as an accusation, but as a man who did not understand a calculation that wasn't built on extraction. Lenora considered how to answer that. She could have said something about her neighbor Soren, about what it felt like to have someone help you when you had nothing to offer in return. She could have made it philosophical. Instead, she said the simpler and more honest version. "Because I know what it feels like when the water runs out," she said, "and I don't want to be the reason it happens to someone else." Aldrich looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the pond. "My herd's in trouble," he said. "I know," she said. "Bring them." He exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "All right." They brought their cattle in that same morning cautiously, at first in small groups, testing the access paths the way Lenora had anticipated. She stood at the basin's edge and managed the flow of animals with the practiced ease of someone who had been working cattle since she could walk, directing the groups in rotation so that the pond wasn't overwhelmed at once, keeping the channels clear as cattle moved through. By midday, she had 60 head in the basin alongside her own 26. By late afternoon, word had reached the next property, and then the next. Soren came that evening and stood beside her on the rim and watched the animals moving through the basin in the long, amber-colored light. "This is going to change things," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Some of these men weren't kind to you." She looked out at the cattle custers. Cattle weren't there yet, but she suspected they would be within the week, because cattle had no pride, and their owners eventually ran out of it when the alternative was watching them die. "No," she said. "They weren't." "Doesn't bother you?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about hard things. It did bother her, in a low, continuous way, like a noise she'd gotten used to hearing, but that was still there. What Custer had said about her body and her intelligence. What the men at Holt's had laughed at. The weight of 8 months of being underestimated. The specific exhaustion of it. "It bothers me," she said finally, "but it doesn't change what the right thing is." Soren was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father would have done this." She looked at the water. "He would have charged more for it," she said, and it was complicated when she said it not unkind, just honest, because Walt Vance had been a complicated man. Soren made a sound that was almost a laugh, probably. The cattle moved through the basin in the darkening light. The artesian spring kept pushing water up from somewhere below the limestone and the pressure and the long, dark geological patience of the earth, and it filled the pond and ran the channels and moved through the white alkaline ground that had once been called worthless. And in the wet margins of those channels, the grass kept coming. 140 head of cattle drank from White Basin before the week was out, and still the spring kept flowing. Dale Custer came on a Thursday. He did not come early in the morning like the others, with their careful testing approach. He came at midday, which was either confidence or bad judgment, and he came alone, which was unusual for him. Lenora saw him from a distance first, his particular way of sitting a horse, upright and deliberate, like a man performing the act of riding for an audience. She was working the South Channel when he arrived, clearing a section that had silted slightly overnight. She straightened up when she heard the horse and looked at him and waited. Custer stopped his horse at what might generously be called a respectful distance and looked out over the basin. He didn't say anything for a moment. She let the moment run out without filling it. He was a tall, lean man in his 50s with a weathered, angular face and the particular kind of confidence that comes from having been right about things often enough that you've stopped factoring in the possibility of being wrong. He had been right about most things in this valley for a long time. He had not been right about White Basin. "Miss Vance," he said. "Mr. Custer." He looked at the pond, at the cattle, including some of his neighbor's stock, drinking at the far edge. His jaw moved slightly, like he was working through something that didn't want to be worked through. "Heard you're letting people bring their cattle in," he said. "That's right. Maintenance fee." "Yes." He looked at her directly for the first time. The usual ease was not quite there, something effortful in its place. Something she recognized as a man choosing words carefully because the easy words were not available to him. "I have 200 head going dry on my east pasture," he said. The directness of it surprised her. She'd expected him to circle it longer. She leaned on the handle of her channel tool and looked at him. She let him wait exactly as long as she needed to let him wait, not for cruelty, but because the moment required it to be real, rather than performed. She had spent 8 months being told she was too large and too female and too simple for this land. She was not going to manage this moment as though that hadn't happened. "The rate's the same for everyone," she said. "Come talk to me at the barn. I'll show you the channels and the rotation schedule." He held her gaze. He was trying to find something in her expression, contempt, maybe, or triumph, something he could react to in a way that would restore his footing. She gave him neither. She just looked at him with the steady, practical attention of a woman who had a lot of work left to do today. "All right," he said, and something in his shoulders came down slightly, like a man accepting a verdict. She turned back to the channel. Behind her, she heard him dismount and lead his horse toward the barn. She did not allow herself to feel triumphant. She had told Aldrich the truth. She genuinely didn't want to be the reason someone else's animals died. But she would be lying to herself if she said there was nothing in that moment, nothing at all, in watching Dale Custer walk across White Basin that everyone had told her was worthless, following a path she had built, toward water she had found, on land he had publicly said a woman of her size and sense would never do anything with. She kept working. The channel ran clear and cold. The cattle drank. The summer heat pressed down on Red Hollow Valley from above, hard and relentless, burning the creek beds and cracking the clay and taking the green out of every pasture in the valley except the thin, stubborn grass growing in the wet margins of Lenora Vance's channels. Above it, below the limestone and the clay and the alkaline crust, the water kept pressing up. It had been there a very long time, she thought. It had been there long before anyone arrived to call the land above it worthless. It had been there in the dark, patient, and pressurized, waiting for someone stubborn enough to dig past what everyone else had already decided was the bottom. She hadn't known it was there, but 26 starving cattle had known first, and she had been willing to trust something other than the consensus of people who hadn't bothered to look. That, she thought, was the part she would never entirely be able to explain to anyone who asked. And that evening, when Soren came again and they sat on the basin rim with their boots off and their feet in the dust, and watched the last of the day's heat lift off the water in thin, barely visible waves, she didn't try to explain it. She just sat with the knowledge of it, solid and real, the way the water was real, the way the green margins were real, the way the ache in her back and the calluses on her hands were real. It had not been clean. None of it had been clean. She had bled for this water and lost sleep over it and carried the weight of being laughed at for every day of the 8 months before she found it. She was still carrying it. It didn't just leave because the situation had changed. She suspected it would take a long time to put down, maybe longer than she thought. But the spring kept flowing, and out in White Basin, in the cooling evening, 160 cattle were alive because of it. The black lacquered wagon appeared on the road to White Basin on a Tuesday morning in the third week of July. Most of its windows were dark, when the drought had been running for 8 weeks, and the valley was in the kind of trouble that made men quiet and watchful in ways they usually weren't. Lenora saw it from a distance. She was up on the basin's western ridge, a section of retaining wall that Soren had flagged the previous afternoon, a stretch of stones that had shifted slightly, after 2 days of cattle traffic, pressed the ground near its base, and from that elevation she could see the road clearly, and she watched the wagon come with the particular attention she'd developed over the past several weeks for anything unfamiliar approaching her property. It was a good wagon. That was the first thing she registered, not in the way of someone admiring craftsmanship, but in the way of someone reading information. The lacquered finish, the matched horses, the way the driver sat on the box, upright and unhurried. People in Red Hollow Valley did not travel in wagons like that. The wagon was from somewhere else, and it was coming to her, and she stood on the ridge with her hand on the retaining wall and watched it come and felt the particular kind of alertness that had nothing specific to attach itself to, yet but was not wrong. Came down off the ridge at an angle that brought her to the basin floor, before the wagon reached the gate, and she was standing in the yard, dirty from the wall work, her hat pushed back, her gloves still on when it pulled up. The man who stepped down was not what she'd expected, though she hadn't known what she was expecting. He was perhaps 50, well-built, with a face that had been arranged by long practice into an expression of pleasant authority. His suit was not new, but it was expensive, and it fit him in the way that expensive things fit people who have always had them, without effort, without announcement. He had light gray eyes and very clean hands, and he smiled at her with the warmth of someone who smiles professionally. "Miss Vance," he said, and his voice was smooth and carrying, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard in large rooms. "My name is Silas Crowther. I apologize for arriving without notice. I was hoping you might spare me a few minutes." Lenora looked at him. She did not remove her gloves or offer her hand, because she was dirty, and she didn't particularly want to make this easy. "What for?" she said. His smile didn't waver. "I represent a land investment company with interests throughout the territory. We've heard some remarkable things about White Basin. I wanted to see it for myself and to speak with you directly about a possible arrangement." She looked past him at the wagon, at the driver still sitting on the box. The driver was looking at the basin. Not at her, not at Crowther at the basin, specifically at the pond, with an attention that was a little too focused to be casual curiosity. She looked back at Crowther. "You came a long way for a few minutes," she said. "Some conversations are worth the journey," he said. She considered him for a moment. He was good at this, she could see that immediately. The warmth in his voice was real enough that you'd have to look for where it was assembled rather than grown, and most people wouldn't look. He had the ease of someone who was very rarely told no, not because he was threatening, but because he made the alternative feel unnecessary. "Come in," she said. "I'll put coffee on." She did not put coffee on. She let him sit at the kitchen table, and she stood at the counter and watched him take in the kitchen, the neatness of it, the worn surfaces, the careful organization of a person managing scarcity with precision, and she saw him cataloging it, making assessments, and she noted that he was doing this and said nothing about it. "I'll be direct with you," Crowther said, folding his hands on the table in a gesture that suggested directness while performing its opposite. "My company has significant interest in water rights throughout this region. The drought has made certain resources considerably more valuable than they were 6 months ago, and White Basin." He paused, looking toward the window that faced the basin. "What you've developed here is remarkable. Genuinely remarkable." "Thank you," Lenora said. She didn't mean it particularly. It was just the polite word for the space. "We would like to make you an offer for the property." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document, which he set on the table and slid toward her without opening it. The figure inside represents a very generous valuation, more than the current market for this region would typically support. "My company is willing to pay a premium because we understand the long-term value of what you've found." Lenora looked at the document. She didn't touch it yet. "How did you hear about White Basin?" she asked. Crowther smiled. Word travels quickly when something significant happens, particularly in a drought. It was a non-answer dressed as an answer, and she recognized it. She picked up the document and unfolded it. The number was large. Larger than she'd expected, and she'd been trying to expect something large so that she wouldn't react to whatever she saw. She felt the reaction anyway, a physical thing, a kind of lurching in her chest, and she held her face still while it passed. She read the document slowly. She had not had legal training, but she had learned to read contracts the way she'd learned everything practical in her life, by necessity and by paying close attention to the parts that were written in smaller print or placed near the end, where tired or overwhelmed people stopped reading. The first page laid out the purchase price, the property description, the basic terms of transfer, clean and clear. The second page began the conditions. She read the conditions carefully. Crowther sat across the table with his hands still folded and his pleasant expression unchanged, and the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of cattle moving somewhere outside and the dry summer wind pushing against the window. Buried in the middle of page 3, in language that was not technically obscure, but was arranged in the way that things are arranged when their author would prefer they not be noticed, was a clause about water rights. The purchase included the transfer of all water rights associated with the property, including subsurface rights, to the acquiring company in perpetuity, with the acquiring company holding sole authority over access, pricing, and distribution of any water resources arising from or beneath the described property. She read it twice to make sure she'd read it right. Then she turned back to page 1 and read the whole document again, from the beginning, more slowly. Crowther, to his credit, didn't try to fill the silence. He waited. He was a patient man. That patience itself told her something. When she finished, she set the document on the table and looked at him. "If I signed this," she said, "your company would own the water." "We'd own the property," he said pleasantly. "The water rights transfer with the land, and you could charge whatever you wanted for access. We would manage the resource responsibly," he said. "My company has considerable experience with." "That's not what I asked," she said. A brief pause. Something moved behind his pleasant expression, too quick to name. "Pricing structure for access would be at the company's discretion," he said. "So yes," she said, "you could charge whatever you wanted." He didn't answer that directly. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, a practiced move, intimate, designed to feel like confidence being shared. "Miss Vance, I want to speak frankly with you. You are managing a significant resource alone, without capital, without infrastructure, without the legal protections that a company's structure provides. What happens to this valley's water if something happens to you? If you're injured or ill? This resource is too important to rest on the shoulders of one person." Lenora looked at him. He was not wrong about the vulnerability. She had thought about it herself late at night, in the way she thought about everything that could go wrong, because it was better to see those things clearly than to be surprised by them. But the way he was using it, wrapping the concern in language that sounded like care, while pointing in directly at her weak spots, made something in her go cold and still. "You're very kind to worry about my health," she said. Another pause. "It's a practical concern, of course." She folded the document along its original creases. "I'll need some time to consider this." He accepted that with good grace, because he had no choice but to accept it, and he was too experienced to let displeasure show when there was still a deal to be made. He gave her a card with his information, the address of the company's regional office, a timeline. He emphasized the word gently, not as a threat but as a nudge for when he'd hoped to hear from her. The best. He left with the same polished ease with which he'd arrived, and his good wagon went back down the road, and Lenora stood in the kitchen doorway and watched it go. Then she went to find Soren. She found him at his property, repairing a gate hinge with the methodical focus he brought to everything mechanical. She told him its windows were dark. She told him about Crowther while he worked, and he listened without interrupting, and when she was done, he set down his tools and looked at the gate for a moment. "Water rights clause on page 3, he said. "Yes." "Classic," he said, and there was something in the word, not surprise, more like a tired recognition. "Buy the land, own the water, restrict access, charge desperate ranchers whatever they'll pay when they're watching their cattle die." He picked up a rag and wiped his hands. "How much did they offer?" she told him. He was quiet for a moment. She knew that silence, it was the silence of a person being honest with themselves about something. "That's a lot of money," he said. "Yes. More than the land is worth on paper, even with the water." "Yes," she said. "Which is interesting." He looked at her. Why would they offer more than it's worth, she said, unless they know something that makes it worth more than they're letting on. Soren was quiet for a long beat. A magpie landed on the fence post near them and regarded them both with the flat, assessing interest of birds that have spent too much time around humans. You think they knew about the water before you found it, he said. I think it's possible. She had been turning this over since Crowther left, pressing on it from different angles, the way she pressed on the ground before digging, looking for the cool spot. Artesian sources don't just appear. The geology has to be right. Swectopseason. Someone who knew what to look for, who had a survey they might have known this basin was sitting over something before any of us started digging. They would have expected you to sell when the debts came, Soren said slowly, or when the bank moved on the productive land. A young woman alone on what everyone said was worthless acreage. Easy marks generally sell, Lenora said, and if I'd sold to the bank when Pruitt first came around, the bank would have sold the whole property eventually, to a developer, to a company with deep pockets. She looked at him, to someone like Silas Crowther. Soren picked up his tools again, slowly. He didn't say anything for a while. Then, you can't prove any of that. No, she agreed. But I don't need to prove it, I just need to not sign the contract. He'll come back, Soren said. Or someone else will, probably. She looked out toward the south, in the direction of White Basin. I need to know if there's anything in that contract that tells me more than he wanted it to. Something that proves they knew about the water before I found it. Soren was quiet. Then he said, Fernsboy, the one in the territorial capital. He reads law. Lenora looked at him. Would he look at a contract? He'd look at it for you, Soren said. He's a good boy. She nodded. I'll have a copy made. She spent the evening copying the contract by hand, word for word, at her kitchen table, by the light of the lamp. Took 2 hours. Her hand cramped twice, and she stopped each time, flexed her fingers and kept going. When she was done, she had 4 pages of careful, close handwriting that she folded and addressed send with the morning mail. Then she sat with the original in front of her and read it a 3rd time. It was on the 3rd reading that she found it. It was small, the kind of small that is achieved deliberately, buried in the property descriptions section where attention tends to drift because property descriptions are written in language so dry and precise that the mind skids off it. The description of the property identified the existing cattle operation as a reference point for the western boundary. And in that description, in parentheses, as a clarifying detail, it noted the current herd size, 26 head. Lenora sat very still. She had not told Crowther how many cattle she had. She had not told him anything about her herd. Their entire conversation had been about the land and the water, and the Avarash had volunteered nothing personal, and he had not asked. 26 was the right number. Her original 26, the Purdy cattle, still intact, she hadn't bought or sold since April. But it was not a number that appeared in any public record, in any document that the bank or the county had processed. In any conversation she'd had with anyone outside of Soren and Fern and Ray Marsh and the handful of ranchers she'd spoken with directly. Someone had told Crowther's company that number, or someone had observed her herd closely enough to count it. Either way, that number in that document meant that Silas, Crowther's company, had been watching White Basin, had been watching White with enough attention and enough access to know specific details about her operation. They had known. They had known something was there, and they had watched, and they had waited for her to fail, or to become desperate enough to sell. And when instead of failing, she had found the water and developed it and kept an entire valley's cattle alive through a drought, they had sent Silas Crowther in his lacquered wagon to buy it out from under her before she understood exactly what she had. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. Outside, the summer night was dry and hot, the kind of heat that doesn't break after dark. She could hear her cattle moving in the basin, a low, distant sound, the sound of animals that were alive and fed and watered. She thought about what this valley would look like if Crowther's company controlled the water. She thought about Ray Marsh and Beaumont and even Aldrich with his sharp measuring face. She thought about Custer, who had mocked her and come crawling and now had 200 head drinking from her basin, and who, despite everything, she did not actually want to see destroyed. She thought about the clause on page 3 and what it would mean for this valley if she signed it. The company would set prices. The company would decide who got water and who didn't, and at what cost. In a drought, with no alternatives, those prices could be anything. People would pay anything. They had to. She picked up the contract and folded it and put it in the tin box under her cot, next to the $6. Then she lay down and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep. She needed the ranchers to know, but she needed to be careful about how she told them. Walking into Holt's feed store and announcing that a land company had tried to buy her water rights was not a plan. It was a way of starting a panic that she would then have to manage on top of everything else. She needed a specific setting, a specific audience, and she needed the evidence in her hands when she spoke. Soren helped her arrange it. He was, it turned out, better connected in the valley's social architecture than his solitary nature suggested. Pupples trusted him the way the trusts oldest tree on a property. Not because it's impressive, but because it's been there through everything and is still standing. He sent to 9 ranchers, the ones with the most cattle currently using White Basin, that there was a meeting at the Vance property on Friday evening. He did not explain why. He said only that it was important and that they should come. All 9 came. Lenora had cleaned the kitchen and moved the table outside under the overhang, and she had set out chairs from the barn that didn't all match, and an oil lamp in the center of the table, and the 9 ranchers sat around it in the cooling evening air with their hats in their hands or on the table in front of them, and she stood at the head of the table and looked at them. Custer was there. He sat at the far end, not quite at ease, his arms crossed in a way that might have been defensive or might have just been how he sat. Marsh was there, and Beaumont and Aldrich with his measuring face. 4 others whose cattle had been drinking from her basin for 3 weeks. And at the side, slightly back from the table, Soren stood with his arms loose at his sides, not performing participation in the meeting, just present. "I want to show you something," Lenora said, and she put the contract on the table. She did not read it to them. She did not explain it in advance. She pushed it toward the nearest man, Beaumont, and said, "Read page 3, the water rights clause, then pass it to the next person." Beaumont picked it up with the slight reluctance of a man handling something he suspects he doesn't want to hold, and he read page 3. His face changed as he read it in a way that was not dramatic, but was clear if you were watching for it, a specific tightening around the eyes. He passed it to his left. Lenora watched it go around the table. Each man read. Each face changed in its own way. Aldrich read it twice, which she appreciated. Custer's jaw moved when he read it, the same gesture she'd seen at the basin, something working through that didn't want to be worked through. When it came back to her, she said, "I'm not going to sign this. But I want you to understand why all of it, not just the water rights clause." She set the contract flat on the table and found the property description section and pushed it back out. "Look at the herd count." She watched them find it. 26, Marsh said. "Yes," she said. He looked up at her. He was a quick man, not brilliant, but practically intelligent in the way that people become when they've spent their lives solving the specific problems of land and weather. She could see him getting there. "Who told them that?" "No one here told them that," she said. "This company has been watching this property. They've been close enough, and for long enough, to know my herd count, which means they knew something about this land before I found the water." She paused. "I think they knew the basin was sitting over an artesian source. I think they were waiting for me to sell or fail, and when I found the water and opened it to the valley, they came with a contract that looks like a generous offer and reads like the end of everything we've built here." The table was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the basin, a cow lowed once and then was quiet. Custer unfolded his arms. He leaned forward and looked at the contract where it lay on the table, and he looked at it for a long moment with an expression that was difficult to read something working in it that he was not going to put into words. Not here. Not in front of all these men. But he looked at it, and he looked at Lenora, and something in the quality of that look was different from the way he'd looked at her at the basin's edge. "What do you need from us?" he said. She had not expected that. Not the words, not the directness, not Custer of all people. She took a breath. "When Crowther comes back," she said, "I don't want to be standing alone." No one said anything for a moment. "He'll come back?" Marsh asked. "He'll come back," she said. "Men like that don't make one trip. They've already invested time and travel, and a careful contract. He'll come back with a better offer or a more sympathetic approach or something I haven't anticipated yet, and he'll expect me to be alone and possibly more worn down than I was the first time. She looked around the table. I'd like him to find that he miscalculated. Aldrich made a sound that was not quite a laugh. After what he'd do to us if he got the water rights, he shook his head. I'll be here. So will I, said Beaumont. The others came to it in their own time, which was the right way to do it, not all at once. Not performed, each man arriving at the decision by his own route. Even Custer, last of all, nodded once, briefly, a minimal gesture that she understood was the largest one he was capable of making toward her in this setting. She looked at all of them, these men who had laughed at her or stood silent while others laughed, who were now sitting at her table in the evening air, with the sound of their cattle resting in her basin behind them. Thank you, she said, and she meant it with the same plainness she'd meant it when Soren offered her hay, simply, without embellishment, because the thing itself was enough. Crowther came back on a Tuesday, exactly 2 weeks after his first visit, which told her he'd planned the interval enough time to let the offer settle, not long enough for her to seek counsel she might actually get. He came in this wagon with the same driver, but this time he brought a second man, younger, with a leather satchel, and the expression of someone whose job it is to look capable and say very little. A lawyer, or something performing the function of one. He was not prepared for the 11 horses tied at Lenora's fence. He covered the hesitation quickly she'd grant him that. He stepped down from the wagon and smiled and walked toward her where she stood in the yard, and his bearing was the same polished ease it had been the first time, but she could see the calculation happening behind the gray eyes, the rapid adjustment of his model of this situation. Miss Vance, he said, I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, she said. I have some neighbors here. I thought it might be useful for them to hear whatever you came to say. Brief pause. These are your neighbors. They all have cattle in White Basin right now, she said simply. They have an interest in what happens to the water. He looked at her for a moment. She held his gaze without difficulty, because she was not angry and she was not nervous. She was clear, which is the most useful thing you can be when someone is trying to find your weakness. Of course, he said. Shall we go in? We'll talk out here, she said. More room. The ranchers had arranged themselves in a loose half-circle behind her, visible without being theatrical about it. Soren was at the edge, arms loose, his old face carrying no particular expression. Custer was to her right, and she had not asked him to stand there, but he'd chosen the position himself, and she understood it for what it was. Crowther looked at the assembled men. His lawyer-adjacent companion had gone still behind him in the way that people go still when they are renegotiating their assessment of a room. I came to discuss the offer further, Crowther said. I believe there's room to improve the terms. Which terms? She said. Purchase price. We can go higher. He named a figure. It was higher, meaningfully higher, the kind of higher that was designed to reach the level where a person stopped calculating and started imagining. She felt it do its work on the air, felt the ranchers behind her feel it too. That's generous, she said, but the water rights clause stays the same, I imagine. Paused. The water rights are fundamental to the transaction. Then the price doesn't matter, she said, because the price is for the land. The water rights are what you actually want, and what this valley can't afford to let you have. Crowther's pleasant expression remained in place, but something beneath it had changed register, and she could see it, now that she'd been looking at him for 2 weeks in her mind, turning him over, looking for the architecture. The warmth was still there, but it had moved slightly from the front of the expression to a layer, behind it replaced, at the surface, by something more frank. Miss Vance, he said, and his voice had shifted slightly too still smooth, but a half step lower, more intimate, the tone of someone putting down the professional script and trying something else. I want to speak to you plainly. A resource like this requires management that's beyond one person's capacity. The drought has made that clear. What if next year is worse? What if the spring's output declines? You need capital and infrastructure, and I found one question I'd like you to answer, she said. Stopped. She reached into her jacket pocket and brought out a single folded page, not the contract, just the property description section, copied in her own hand. She set it on the fence post beside her and pointed to the herd count. Your contract describes my herd as 26, she said. That number doesn't appear in any county record, any bank document, or any conversation I've had with anyone in your company could have contacted through normal channels. She looked at him. How did your company know that number? Silence. Behind Crowther, his companion shifted his weight. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but it was the kind of movement that happens when a person realizes the ground under a situation has just changed. Crowther said, property assessments involve, no one has assessed this property since my father died, she said. The bank documented the eastern acreage they took. White Basin was left off because it wasn't considered worth the cost of assessment. She paused. So I'll ask again. How did your company know my herd count? The silence that followed was longer than the first one. She could hear the ranchers behind her breathing. She could hear the cattle in the basin. She could hear the dry summer wind, the same wind that had been stripping moisture from this valley for 2 months. Crowther did not answer the question. He attempted to redirect. She watched him build the redirect in real time, watched him reach for a different approach with the practiced ease of a man who has redirected hundreds of conversations. But she had asked a specific question, and he had not answered it, and everyone present knew he had not answered it. And the silence where his answer should have been was telling everyone exactly what they needed to know. Your company has been watching this property, she said. You knew about the water before I found it, and you were waiting for me to fail. When I didn't fail, you came with a contract designed to look like an opportunity and function like a transfer of everything this valley needs to survive. She picked up the paper from the fence post and put it back in her pocket. I'm not going to sign your contract, and I'd like you to leave my property. Crowther stood very still for a moment. She had been braced for anger, the kind of anger that expensive men produce when they are told no by people they've underestimated, and she was ready for it, had calculated what to do with it. But he didn't give her anger. He gave her something worse, a small, measured smile, the smile of a man accepting a setback while already planning the next approach. I respect your position, he said. The offer remains open. He gathered his companion and walked back to the wagon with the same unhurried ease as before. The driver turned the horses. The lacquered wagon went back down the road. No one spoke for a moment. Then Aldrich, from somewhere behind her right shoulder, said, The offer remains open. He said it in a flat, mimicking tone, the way you repeat something to understand it. He really just said that. He'll try something else, Soren said. He said it as information, not alarm. Probably, Lenora agreed. She was looking at the road where the wagon had gone, and she was not satisfied. Satisfaction felt premature and too clean for what this was. She had won today's exchange. That was real. But she understood what Soren understood, that men with capital and patience and a specific known goal do not stop because one conversation went against them. They reroute. They find other angles. They wait. She turned back to the ranchers. Custer was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read, and she suspected she wasn't supposed to be able to read it. It was the expression of a man working through something privately that he would not make public. But his eyes were direct when they met hers, and he said nothing, and she nodded at him once, and he nodded back. It was not forgiveness on either side. It was something smaller and more durable, a recognition of the situation they were both in now, the ground they were both standing on, the water they both needed to protect. Marsh let out a long breath. So what do we do now? Lenora looked at White Basin. The sun was moving toward the western ridge, and the pond was catching the light, and the green margins of the channels were the most vivid color in a valley that had been slowly turning brown for 2 months. And her cattle were moving through the late afternoon with the easy, purposeful pace of animals that had come all the way from starving to thriving on this pale alkaline ground that everyone had called worthless. We document everything, she said. The water output, the flow rate, the usage, the maintenance, everything in writing witnessed. She looked at Soren. I want a legal record of what this spring is and what it does, and who has been using it and on what terms. Something that can't be argued with. Soren nodded. Fern's boy can help with that. Good. She looked at the others. And we keep the basin open, fair rates. Same for everyone. Nothing changes. She paused. Because the best argument against Crowther's company is a valley that's already organized and functional and doesn't need them. Beaumont scratched his chin. That might actually work, he said, with the tone of a man surprised by the simplicity of something. It might, Lenora said. She didn't promise more than that. The rancher stayed another hour, talking through logistics, who would contribute to the documentation, who would help with the legal costs of having it properly registered. Custer contributed more than anyone expected. He did it quietly, without announcement, the way a large man tries to move in a small space carefully, aware of the damage he could do if he wasn't paying attention. When they all left, Lenora stayed in the yard after the last horse went down the road, alone with the cooling evening and the sound of the basin settling into night. Soren paused before he left. "You did well today," he said. She shook her head slightly. "I asked one question and watched him not answer it. He did the work." "You built the room where that could happen," Soren said. "That's the work that mattered." She looked at him, this old man, who had shown up with hay when she had nothing, who had crouched in the basin and pressed his hands against the cool ground and told her the truth about what it might mean, who had never once in all of it made her feel small for needing help. "Thank you," she said, for the third or fourth time. It never seemed like enough. "Stop thanking me," he said, but not unkindly. Put his hat on. "Get some sleep. You're going to need it." He walked back toward his property in the last of the evening light, and Lenora stood into the yard and listened to the basin, the low sounds of cattle, the distant, barely audible movement of water through channels they had built with their hands, and she thought about Crowther's parting smile, that open, patient smile, and what it meant. He wasn't done. She knew that. The valley knew that. But for the first time, since April, since the debts and the bank and the pale, dead ground that everyone said she was foolish to hold on to, she didn't feel like she was standing on the wrong side of the odds. She was still on her land. The water was still flowing. Cattle were alive. And whatever Silas Crowther was planning, he was going to have to come through all of it to get to her. Crowther's smile had told her everything she needed to know, and what it told her was this: he was not finished, and he was not worried, and those two things together meant he had something else prepared that she hadn't seen yet. She spent the following week waiting for it, which was its own kind of labor. She worked the basin, managed the rotation of cattle coming through, corresponded with Fern's boy in the territorial capital. His name was Edmund, and he wrote back in a tight, precise hand that suggested he took his work seriously, and she tried to keep her attention on what was directly in front of her rather than on the threat she couldn't yet see the shape of. Soren came each morning and they worked together, and he did not bring up Crowther unless she did, which she appreciated. He understood that there is a particular exhaustion in talking about a problem you can't yet solve, and that sometimes the better use of the hours is just to keep your hands moving on the work that's actually in front of you. The documentation effort was proceeding. Marsh had turned out to be methodical and reliable. In this regard, he kept a daily log of cattle numbers, entering the basin, maintenance hours, and water levels with a consistency that surprised Lenora, and which she suspected reflected his need to do something concrete in the face of a situation that had too many uncertain edges. Beaumont contributed his own records. Even Aldrich, who had seemed primarily motivated by self-interest when he first appeared at her gate, had taken on the task of documenting the spring's output measurements with a seriousness that had either been there all along or had developed once he understood what was at stake. Custer did not contribute to the documentation. He showed up most days with his cattle, paid the maintenance fee without discussion, and was courteous in a stiff, careful way that told her he was managing himself around her with a deliberateness he hadn't needed before. She did not require more than that from him. She had not forgiven him. Forgiveness was a different thing that required time and some evidence of genuine change rather than the tactical criticism of a man who needed her water. But she had put what he'd done into a category she could work around, and she was moving forward. It was Tobin who brought her the first warning. He came on a Saturday morning. He still came most days, this 12-year-old who had accidentally started all of this by telling his mother about the spring, and who had been atoning for it with labor ever since. He had the particular guilt permit of a child who is genuinely decent and had made a genuine mistake, and Lenora had told him twice that he didn't owe her anything, which had made no difference at all. He came that Saturday morning, moving faster than usual, his horse slightly lathered. "There's a man in town," he said, before he'd fully dismounted. "At the county recorder's office. Was there yesterday, too." Fern's sister saw him and said he was looking at land records. Lenora straightened from the channel she'd been clearing. What kind of man? Suit, nice boots, talking to the recorder about water rights and land histories. Tobin's young face was tight with the effort of delivering information he knew mattered without knowing exactly how. She said he had a company name on the papers he was carrying. She couldn't see all of it, but she saw Crowther on the top. Lenora looked at him for a moment. How long ago was this? Yesterday afternoon. She told Ferns this morning, and Fern sent me straight here. She thanked him and sent him to find Soren. Then she went to the barn, saddled her horse, and rode toward Red Hollow. The county recorder's office was a single-room building next to the courthouse, with a door that stuck in damp weather and 2 windows that let in light the color of old paper. The recorder was a woman named Hattie Doyle, 50-something, precise. Most of its windows were dark and possessed of the particular authority of someone who has been the keeper of important information for so long that they have absorbed some of its weight. Lenora had been in the office twice since her father died, once for the debt settlement documentation, and once to verify the boundaries of White Basin after the bank took the eastern acreage. On both occasions, Hattie Doyle had dealt with her without condescension, which in Lenora's recent experience was rarer than it should have been. She went in and closed the sticking door behind her, and Hattie looked up from her ledger. "Miss Vance," she said, not surprised, which itself was information. "Someone's been in here looking at my land records," Lenora said. Hattie set down her pen. "I can't discuss specific parties who access public records," she said. "Public records are public. Anyone can request them." "I understand that," Lenora said. "I'm not asking you to tell me who. I'm asking what records were requested, because that's also public information." She paused. "If you're willing." Hattie looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether a thing is her business. Then she reached for the request log without making any announcement about it and set it on the counter and turned it so it faced Lenora. The entries from the past 2 days were there. Land records for White Basin going back 30 years. Subsurface rights documentation there wasn't much, because the territory's recording of subsurface rights was inconsistent and incomplete, a fact that Lenora had already learned from Edmund's first letter. Historical ownership chain, going back to the original homestead claim. And there, on yesterday's entry, geological survey records, Red Hollow Basin, Territorial Survey 1887. Lenora looked at that entry for a long moment. "Is there a territorial geological survey on file here?" she asked. "There's a copy," Hattie said. "The original is in the Capitol." "Can I see it?" Hattie went to the filing cabinets at the back of the room. It was gone for 3 minutes. When she came back, she was carrying a bound document, thin, aging, the kind of document that spends most of its life in a cabinet because nobody thinks they need it until they do. She set it on the counter. Lenora opened it. The 1887 Territorial Survey had been conducted by a geologist named Ambrose Kell, commissioned by the territorial government to assess the region's potential for agricultural development, specifically water availability. Covered most of the valley and the surrounding range. She found the section on the White Basin area on page 41. Kell had noted the alkaline soil and the characteristic basin formation and had assessed the surface conditions as poor for agriculture. That part matched everything, everyone had always said. But in the subsurface section, in careful, technical language that a person would have to know what to look for to understand, he had described the geological formations beneath the basin with words that included artesian potential and significant aquifer probability, and a recommendation that any future development of the area include subsurface exploration. Most of its windows were dark. The survey was 36 years old. Cabinet, in the Red Hollow County Recorder's Office for 36 years, available to anyone who knew it existed and knew to ask for it. Lenora stood at the counter and read the relevant section twice, and felt something go very cold and very clear inside her. Crowther's company had not stumbled onto White Basin by noticing a drought-era news item about a woman who found water. They had known about this survey, or someone had, and they had identified White Basin as a probable artesian site years ago, possibly before Lenora's father ever took on his debts. They had been patient in the way that companies can be patient when they are operating on geological time and not personal time. They had watched and waited for the land to become available. And when Walt Vance died, And when Walt Vance died and left his daughter with debts and what everyone called worthless land, they had seen their moment approaching. She wrote down the key passages from the survey in her notebook, word for word, with the page numbers beside each entry. She thanked Hattie Doyle, who accepted the thanks with a small nod that conveyed she understood the significance of what had just happened here and was content to have no further part in it. Lenora rode back to White Basin with the notebook in her jacket pocket pressed against her ribs. Edmund's second letter arrived 4 days later. It was longer than the first and more specific, and it contained information that made her sit down at the kitchen table and read it 3 times. He had found, in the territorial capital's records, a filing from 18 months ago filed quietly, with minimal fanfare, the way things are filed, when the filer would prefer they not be noticed, in which a company called Crowther Regional Development had registered a formal interest in the subsurface water rights of several parcels in Red Hollow Valley. The filing was incomplete by legal standards. It referenced rights that had not yet been formally transferred, and it had been flagged by a clerk as premature, and the flag had not been resolved. What this meant, Edmund wrote carefully, was that Crowther's company had attempted to pre-register water rights they didn't own yet, on land they didn't own yet, on the assumption that they would acquire it. It was legally questionable at best, and potentially fraudulent, depending on how a judge chose to read the territorial statutes. More importantly, it established in the territorial government's own records that Crowther's company had specific knowledge of the artesian potential of White Basin at least 18 months before Lenora found it. She wrote back to Edmund the same day she received his letter, asking him what it would take to have the filing formally challenged and what documentation he would need to support a legal claim of prior and predatory intent. His third letter came back in 6 days. It contained a list. She had most of what he needed. For the rest, she needed the survey document, which Hattie Doyle provided as a certified copy of without being asked twice. She needed witness statements from the ranchers who could confirm that Crowther's agent had approached her before the valley's general awareness of the spring was established. Marsh and Beaumont provided these in writing within 2 days, and Aldrich came a day after that. And she needed one more thing, which Edmund had identified as potentially the most important piece. She needed someone inside Crowther's company, or near it, who could confirm the timeline of the company's knowledge. She did not have that. She sat with that gap in her documentation and felt the weight of it, because everything else she was building was circumstantial convincing. She thought, circumstantial. A good lawyer for Crowther's company could argue around geological surveys and premature filings and the coincidence of a herd count appearing in a contract. She needed something direct. She was thinking about where to find it when Custer came to see her. He came alone, on foot, which was unusual enough that she noticed it before she recognized him. He came across the basin from the direction of the south access path, walking with his characteristic upright deliberateness. And he came to where she was working on the north channel, and he stopped about 6 feet away and took off his hat. She straightened up and waited. He held his hat in his hands, a man unconsciously performing the gesture of someone who has come to say something he'd rather not say. He was looking at the channel, not at her. When he spoke to the channel. I knew a man who worked for Crowther, he said. Lenora said nothing. Not current. 3-4 years ago, man named Fielder. He worked as a land scout, rode around looking for properties with specific geological characteristics, made notes, filed reports with the company. Custer's jaw moved. He was here in the valley. I saw him. Didn't think much of it at the time land scouts come through. It's not unusual. He was writing the basin country specifically. He finally looked at her. I didn't put it together until the meeting. When you showed us that contract, Lenora looked at him steadily. You're telling me this now, she said. Yes. Why now? He met her eyes. Because I should have said something at the meeting. And I didn't. Because I don't like what Crowther's company would do to this valley if they got the water. And I liked thinking about you signing that contract even less once I understood what it actually said. He paused. And because I said things about you that I had no right to say, and this is something I can do. The kitchen window was open. The wind moved through it. Outside, she could hear cattle. She looked at Dale Custer, this man who had laughed at her at Holt's, and through a tavern door, who had looked at her large body and her difficult land and her starving cattle and built a complete and contemptuous picture of her future from those materials, and she looked at him standing with his hat in his hands, and she felt the complexity of it, which was not forgiveness and not exactly anger either, but something that contained both and was more than both. "Fielder," she said. "Do you know where he is now?" "Last I heard, he was still in the territory, working independently." Custer paused. "I think he left Crowther's company on bad terms." "Would he talk?" "I don't know," Custer said honestly. "I know he wasn't happy when he left, and I know men who worked surveys with him. I might be able to find out where he is." She looked at the basin, at the channels and the pond and the thin, stubborn green that kept coming back along the water's edges, despite everything the summer had done to prevent it. "Find out," she said. He nodded. He put his hat back on. He started to turn away, and then he stopped, and he stood with his back to her for a moment. "That thing I said," he said, "at the tavern." "I heard it," she said. "I know." He didn't turn around. "I'm not asking you to tell me it's all right." "It's not all right." She didn't say anything. "I'm just telling you I know it," he said. He walked back toward the south access path, and she watched him go, and she picked up her channel tool and went back to work, because the work was there, and it needed doing, and standing still, accomplishing nothing with it wouldn't give her back the 8 months she'd spent carrying what he'd said. But something shifted slightly. Not much. Enough to register. Custer found Fielder in 10 days, which was faster than she'd expected. He sent word through Marsh, who sent Tobin, who arrived at White Basin on a Thursday morning with a folded note. Fielder was in a town called Drought, 40 miles east. He was doing independent land assessments. He had left Crowther Regional Development in disputed circumstances, and the dispute had involved, according to Custer's information, a disagreement about how the company was using the survey data that men like Fielder had collected. She rode to Durance with Soren. She left at first light, and they rode mostly in silence, the way people who know each other can ride together without filling the space between them with noise. The land they crossed was dry, drought pale, and dusty, the grass thin and yellowed, creek beds that should have been running in July, showing only cracked mud and the dark watermarks of where the water used to be. Durance was a small town, smaller than Red Hollow, with a main street that had 3 businesses still operating and 2 with boards across their windows. She found Fielder at the second address Custer had given her, a boarding house at the end of a side street. He was in his 40s, compact and weathered, with the quiet, watchful manner of a man who spends a lot of time alone in open country. He opened the door of his room and looked at her and looked at Soren and waited. "My name is Lenora Vance," she said. "I own White Basin." "Been there." He was quiet for a moment. "Come in," he said. The room was small and clean, with a desk that had maps on it, not Crowther's maps, she noted, her own independent work. He sat in the desk chair, and she and Soren sat on the 2 other chairs, and they looked at each other. "How'd you find me?" he asked. "Dale Custer." Something moved across his face. "Custer." He exhaled slightly. "All right. I need to know what you found when you surveyed White Basin," she said, "and what the company did with that information." He looked at her for a long moment. "This isn't a casual conversation you're asking me to have." "No," she agreed. "It's not. If I talk about what the company knew, and when they knew it, I'm exposing myself to legal risk from them. Confidentiality terms." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to make it easy. I'm asking you to decide what you think is right." Another long silence. He looked at the maps on his desk, then back at her. "What I found in White Basin," he said slowly, "was one of the most significant artesian indicators I've ever documented. The formation beneath that basin is deep, old, and pressurized in a way that the surface gives no indication of. I wrote a report that said the land was worth 50 times what it was being sold for more, if the artesian source was developed correctly." He paused. "The company received that report 2 years ago." Lenora sat very still. "They identified the current landowner, your father, at that point, and determined that his financial situation made the property likely to come available in the near term. They decided to wait." Fielder's voice was level and careful, a man choosing words as though he knows they may be repeated in another context. "When I found out how they were planning to use the resource restricting access, pricing against drought conditions, I objected. We disagreed about it substantially. I left." "Would you put that in writing?" she asked. "A sworn statement witnessed, documenting what you found and when the company received the report. He looked at her. What are you going to do with it? She told him. The full documentation effort, Edmund's work in the capital, the premature water rights filing, the survey from 1887, the witness statements. She laid it out plainly, without embellishment, the way she had laid out the maintenance fee terms to Aldrich accurately, without trying to make it more than it was. When she finished, Fielder was quiet for a moment. He looked at the maps again. Then he looked at her with the expression of a man who has been thinking about a decision for a long time and has just arrived at it. I'll need a few days to write it up properly, he said. Take the time you need, she said. I'll send Edmund's address. He's the one handling the legal side. Fielder nodded. He looked at Soren. You're the old rancher from the northeast section. Soren raised an eyebrow. You surveyed my property too? Briefly. You weren't home. He paused. Your land isn't sitting on anything special, if that's a concern. Soren made the sound that was almost a laugh. It was a concern until about a minute ago. They rode back toward Red Hollow in the late afternoon, when the heat was starting to slide off the top of the day, without actually becoming cool. The road was empty, and the sky was the dense, shadowless blue of deep summer, and the dust their horses raised hung in the air behind them in the still air. About 15 miles out, Soren said, he'll do it. Yes, she said. I think so. That's what you needed. It's what Edmund said we needed. She was looking at the road ahead. If Crowther's company receives a notice from the Territorial Recorder's Office that their premature water rights filing is under formal challenge, with a geological survey and a whistleblower statement attached, they may decide the legal cost outweighs the prize. May, Soren said. May, she agreed. Or they may decide to fight it. Soren adjusted his hat. You thought about what happens if they fight it? She had thought about almost nothing else. If they fight it, it goes to a territorial judge. Edmund says the premature filing is on shaky legal ground. The statutes don't clearly permit pre-registration of rights on unacquired property. And Fielder's statement establishes predatory intent, which isn't a clean thing for a company to have on the record. That's a lot of legal uncertainty for a ranch woman who 6 months ago had $42. It is, she said. But I have the ranchers' support. Marsh and Beaumont and Aldrich have all said they'll testify. Custer, she paused. Custer will testify if it comes to that. Think he will. Soren was quiet for a while. The horses moved through the dry country. Somewhere ahead, a hawk was working a thermal above a ridge. Your father, Soren said, and stopped. What about him? He knew that land had something in it. Soren said it carefully, like a man describing something he isn't certain of. He never said so to me directly, but he held on to White Basin even when he could have sold it. When selling, it might have helped with the debts. Most people in his situation would have let it go. Lenora had thought about this. In the late nights when she lay on the cot, going over everything, the debts, the bank, Crowther, the contract, the survey, she had thought about her father and White Basin, and the fact that he had held even when holding it made no obvious sense. He didn't know about the cattle, she said. He didn't have 26 starving animals that walked straight to the cool spot and started pawing at the ground. No, Soren agreed. He held onto it because of something he felt, she said, not because of anything he could prove. Soren nodded slowly. That's what I thought. She looked at the road and thought about her father, complicated, secretive, financially reckless, possessed of a stubbornness that had, depending on the day, seemed like his greatest flaw or his only genuine gift. He had carried debts in silence, and he had held a piece of land in silence, and both of those silences had ultimately passed to her, along with everything they contained. She had dug into one of those silences and found water. The other one she was still learning to live with. Crowther's third approach came not through another visit, but through a letter. It arrived at the end of July, addressed to Lenora in a clean, formal hand, and its tone had shifted meaningfully from the professional warmth of his first visit and the slight directness of his second. Most of its windows were dark. This letter was legalistic in its language, still polite, but carrying the particular weight of language that has been reviewed by attorneys before being sent. It informed her that Crowther Regional Development maintained a registered interest in the subsurface water rights of the White Basin property, and that the company believed this interest had legal standing under territorial statutes. It noted that the company had not yet filed a formal legal claim, but reserved the right to do so. Strongly encouraged Miss Vance to consider the company's offer, which remained open, and to consult with a legal representative before making any decisions. It was, she recognized, a threat dressed as advice. Strongly encourages and reserves the right and registered interest were doing specific work. They were designed to make her feel the ground shifting under her, to make the legal terrain seem uncertain and expensive and beyond her resources. She wrote back the same day. She kept it brief. She wrote that she was aware of the filing the company had made in the territorial capital 18 months ago, that she was working with a legal representative, and that any further contact regarding the property should be directed to Edmund at his address in the capital. Then she signed it, addressed it, and sent it. The response came back in 4 days, not a letter this time, but a telegram. 4 words: our offer stands. Crowther. She showed it to Soren. He's nervous, Soren said. A nervous man with lawyers, she said. Still nervous, Soren said. Edmund's response to being named as her representative was a longer letter than any he'd sent before, in which he laid out his assessment of the legal terrain with a frankness she appreciated. Case was not clean, no case involving conflicting interpretations of territorial water rights statutes was ever clean, he said. But Fielder's statement, which had arrived at Edmund's office 3 days earlier, and which Edmund described as remarkably clear and specific for a document of this kind, substantially strengthened her position. The premature filing was, in his assessment, challengeable. He recommended filing the formal challenge promptly, before Crowther's company could move first. She authorized it by return letter. The challenge was filed in the second week of August. Crowther's response arrived through attorneys 2 weeks after that. It was aggressive in its language and specific in its legal arguments, citing territorial precedents that Edmund, in his next letter, called selectively applied and probably not persuasive to a judge who has read the full context of those cases. The company was not backing down. But neither, the attorney's language made clear, were they entirely confident. The kind of confidence that comes from a certain position reads differently on paper than the kind that comes from fighting from a weaker one, and this letter had the quality of the latter. Lenora read it at the kitchen table and then set it with the other documents in the box. She'd started keeping specifically for this the expanding paper trail of a fight she hadn't started, but had no intention of losing. Outside the window, the basin was still green along the channels. Cattle moved through it in the August heat. The spring was still flowing, steady and cold and indifferent to the legal documents accumulating in Lenora's kitchen. She thought about the 1,887 survey Ambrose Kell, who had looked at White Basin 36 years ago and seen what she had seen and written it down in careful technical language that had sat unread in a filing cabinet while the land above it changed hands and accumulated debts and was called worthless by everyone who looked at its surface and stopped there. She thought about Crowther's company, which had found that survey and sat on the information for 2 years, waiting for the right moment, planning to walk through a door they expected to find wide open. They had not expected her to be standing in it. They had not expected 26 starving cattle to know something nobody else knew, and they had not expected a woman who would trust that knowledge enough to pick up a spade and start digging in the dark. The letter from the territorial judge's office arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in late August, 3 weeks after the formal challenge was filed. Edmund had told her the process could take months. The fact that it had taken 3 weeks told her something, though she wasn't certain what legal timing carried in information but not always interpretable information, and she had trained herself to be patient about this particular uncertainty. She sat on the porch to read it, because she had learned not to read things that mattered in the kitchen, where she might grip the table in the way she'd been gripping it too often lately. Out here, with the basin visible and the late afternoon light doing what it did to the water, she had better balance. The letter was from a territorial judge named Arthur Birch. It was 3 pages long. It acknowledged the formal challenge to Crowther Regional Development's water rights filing and noted that the challenge had raised substantive questions about the legality of pre-registration of rights on unacquired property. It described Fielder's statement as material evidence and the 1,887 geological survey as directly relevant to the question of prior knowledge. It did not yet rule on the challenge. That would come at a formal hearing, the date for which was set for 12 weeks hence. But it ordered, pending the hearing, that Crowther Regional Development, take no action to assert or transfer the disputed water rights. A stay of the filing's legal effect, in plain language. She read the order twice. 12 weeks. The hearing in 12 weeks. The spring still flowing. The documentation still building. Edmund still working. Fielder's statement in the record. The rancher's testimonies ready if needed. She folded the letter and held it in her lap and looked at White Basin in the late afternoon light. It was not over. She knew that she had come far enough and fought long enough to distrust the feeling of the finish line approaching, because twice in the past several months she'd thought she could see it, and then found that the road had extended past the point she'd mapped. But it was not nothing either. It was an order from a territorial judge, and it had Crowther's company's name on it, and it meant that, for 12 weeks at minimum, the water in White Basin was exactly what it had always been since the day she'd hauled her father's spade out to the cool patch and started digging. Hers. She heard Soren's footsteps on the path from the north. She recognized his walk now, the particular rhythm of it, the way he moved when he wasn't in any hurry and wasn't pretending to be, and she held up the letter without turning around, so he could see it as he approached. He came and stood at the edge of the porch and read it over her shoulder. When he was done, he was quiet for a moment. 12 weeks, he said. Yes. We'll build more documentation in 12 weeks. Yes, she said. Edmund has a list. Soren sat down on the porch step carefully, with the particular care of an old man's joints, and they both looked at the basin in the last light. Your cattle are fat, he said. She looked at her herd, moving in the far end of the basin. They were fat. They were the same 26 animals that Purdy had brought down the road in April, with their ribs showing through their hides, and their heads hung low, and they were now thick through the shoulders, and bright-eyed, and moving with the easy authority of animals that had been well for a long time and expected to continue. They knew first, she said. They did, Soren agreed. Its windows were dark. They sat on the porch as the sun went down behind the western ridge, and the shadow moved across White Basin, and the water caught the last of the light before the shadow reached it, and then let the light go. And the basin settled into the blue-gray of evening, with the sounds of cattle and the thin, barely audible sound of the artesian spring moving through its channels. The summer was almost finished. The drought would break. Eventually, droughts always broke, even the bad ones. Creeks would fill, and the pastures would recover, and Red Hollow Valley would go back to looking like the valley. It was most of the time the one that didn't need anyone to save it. But the spring in White Basin would still be flowing when the drought was over. It would still be flowing when the rains came back. It would flow next summer, and the summer after that, cold and constant, because it had been flowing long before Lenora Vance arrived, and it had no intention of stopping on account of anything happening on the surface above it. She pressed both palms flat on her thighs, the rough calluses, the healed blisters, the permanent stain of alkaline soil in the creases of her knuckles, and she felt the solid weight of her own hands, and thought about the 12 weeks ahead, and everything that still needed doing. Then she stood up, because there was supper to make, and a letter to write to Edmund, and a channel section that needed checking before full dark. The work was not done. The work was never entirely done. But she was still here, still on her land, and the water was still rising. The 12 weeks between the judge's stay order and the formal hearing were the strangest period Lenora had lived through since her father died stranger. In some ways, because grief at least has a recognizable shape, a direction it moves in, while waiting for a legal process to resolve itself has no shape at all, just a formless pressure that sits on everything you do and doesn't lift. She worked. That was what she did. With the waiting, she filled it with work the way you pack insulation into a wall, so the cold has less room to get through. The channels needed constant maintenance, as the summer heat continued into September, and the cattle rotation required daily management as the number of animals using the basin had grown to nearly 240 head across 11 ranches. She kept the logs Marsh had started, added her own observations, corresponded with Edmund every week without fail. Edmund's letters back were measured and thorough, and she had come to trust his judgment in the specific way you trust someone who is consistently honest about the limits of their own certainty. He did not promise her outcomes. He described probabilities and explained reason and identified the places where the law was unclear enough that a judge's disposition would matter as much as the evidence. She appreciated this, even when it made the uncertainty larger rather than smaller, because she had spent enough time being told comforting things that weren't quite true to have developed a strong preference for uncomfortable things that were. Fielder sent a supplemental statement in mid-September, unprompted, which Edmund described in his next letter as exceptionally useful. In it, Fielder had elaborated on the specific nature of his survey findings and the internal company discussions he had been present, for discussions in which the White Basin artesian source was referenced not as a speculative possibility but as a near certainty, and in which the strategy of waiting for the current landowner to become financially desperate enough to sell had been explicitly discussed. He named dates. He named other people who had been in those discussions. This was, Edmund wrote, the direct evidence they had needed, not circumstantial, not inferential, a first-hand account with names and dates attached. Lenora read that letter standing at the kitchen counter, and she set it down, and she looked at the wall for a moment, and she felt something she had not let herself feel during the entire 12 weeks, a tentative, careful loosening of something she'd been holding tight since the day Crowther first drove his lacquered wagon through her gate. She did not call it victory. She was not that reckless. But she allowed herself to breathe slightly differently. And that was enough for now. The hearing was held in the territorial capital on a Thursday in early November, in a courtroom that smelled of wood polish and old paper, and the particular institutional seriousness of a room where a great deal of arguing had been done over a long time. Lenora rode the train for the first time in 4 years to get there. Soren came with her, which she had not asked for, and which he had not announced in advance. He simply appeared at the station with a bag and a ticket, and said, "I've never been to the capital in winter," which was probably not true, but was a polite way of declining to explain himself. Edmund met them outside the courthouse. He was younger than his letters had suggested, mid-30s, with an earnest face and the kind of organized mind that keeps lists. He shook her hand with both of his and said, "I want you to know that I think we're in a very strong position," and then immediately said, "I never tell clients that, unless I believe it, because the alternative is that I've created false hope and then have to watch someone be devastated, and I hate that." She liked him immediately. Crowther's attorneys were 2 men from a firm in the territorial capital who wore matching dark suits and carried identical leather cases and spoke with the polished efficiency of people who do this and consider most of the people on the other side of their arguments to be obstacles rather than adversaries. They were good. She could see that. They were the kind of good that money buys, and Crowther's company had bought a great deal of it. She sat beside Edmund at the plaintiff's table, and she looked at the room, and she thought about the kitchen table in the Vance house where Pruitt had sat with his uncapped pen and his ledger. Most of its windows were dark, and she thought about how much of her life had been conducted across tables at which the other persons assumed the outcome before the conversation began. She was done with that assumption. The hearing lasted 2 days. The first day was dense with legal argument, Edmund presenting the challenge to the premature filing, Crowther's attorneys defending the validity of their registered interest, both sides citing territorial statutes that the judge, a deliberate man named Arthur Birch, read with the focused attention of someone who is going to form his own opinion, regardless of how persuasively either side argues. Lenora testified in the afternoon of the first day. She had prepared for this with Edmund over 3 long evenings, not scripting her answers, but understanding the landscape of questions she'd be navigating. He had told her to answer directly and stop when the answer was complete, which was advice she found easy to follow because she had been doing exactly that her whole life. Crowther's lead attorney was a man named Geary, and he had the manner of someone who uses politeness as a precision instrument. He was never overtly rude, but each question was shaped to push her slightly off balance, to make her answers sound either naive or calculating, depending on which direction the question pointed. He spent considerable time on the sequence of her cattle purchase, the discovery of the spring, the timing of her conversations with Soren. He was built a picture of a woman who might have known about the geological potential of her land before she claimed to. She answered each question directly and stopped when the answer was complete, and after 30 minutes of this, she could see that the picture he was trying to build was not cohering the way he needed it to, because the timeline of her actions was exactly what she had said it was, and the documents supported it, and there was no seam in it that he could widen into doubt. He shifted approach. He asked about Fielder. Did you seek out this individual specifically to obtain testimony against my client's company? I sought him out to learn what he knew, she said. What he knew turned out to be testimony against your client. A brief pause. You would agree that it was in your interest for him to testify against my client. I would agree that the truth was in my interest, she said, and the truth is what he provided. Geary moved on. She got down from the stand at 5 o'clock, and Edmund touched her arm briefly and said, quietly, "Good," and she nodded and sat back down and drank a glass of water and let her hands stop being careful about their stillness. Soren was in the gallery. When she glanced at him, he tilted his head slightly, a small gesture, the equivalent of a nod from a man who doesn't make large gestures in public. She looked away before she read too much into it. Fielder testified on the second morning. He was a contained man on the stand, not cold, but economical, using exactly as many words as the question required, and no more. When Geary cross-examined him, pushing at the circumstances of his departure from Crowther's company, trying to establish that his testimony was motivated by personal grievance rather than factual accuracy, Fielder listened to each question with an expression of neutral patience and then answered it with a specificity that kept defeating the implication. At one point, Geary asked, "Isn't it true that you left Crowther Regional Development under contentious circumstances?" "Yes," Fielder said. "And that you filed a wage dispute with the company at the time of your departure?" "Yes." "So you have personal financial grievances against the company." "I had a wage dispute that was settled," Fielder said. "What I'm testifying to today is what I observed and documented while I worked there. Those are two separate things. I can distinguish between them. I'd expect the court to as well." There was a silence in the courtroom after that. Judge Birch, who had been largely expressionless throughout the proceedings, wrote something in his notes. Geary moved on. The hearing concluded at 2 in the afternoon of the second day, with closing arguments that Lenora listened to, with her hands flat on her knees and her attention fully engaged, because she had learned by now that the language of legal arguments contains information about confidence in the same way that a person's posture does, if you know how to read it. Edmund was clear and specific and built his argument on the documentary record without embellishment. Geary was fluent and technically precise, but was working, she thought, against the grain of his own evidence, and some of his arguments had the quality of a wall, being built slightly too quickly to be fully sound. Judge Birch thanked both parties, said he would issue his ruling within 30 days, and adjourned. They walked out into the November air, cold and clear, the kind of cold that makes everything look sharp and slightly unreal, and Lenora stood on the courthouse steps and exhaled slowly. 30 days, Soren said. 30 days, she agreed. Could be worse, he said. Edmund came out behind them, already organizing papers into his case. I think the testimony held, he said. I think Fielder's specific documentation of the internal discussions is going to be very difficult for the judge to set aside. He paused. I want to be honest, I'm not certain, but I think we're in a good position. She looked at him. You told me that before. I told you I believed it then, he said. I still believe it. I just also believe in being honest about uncertainty. She almost smiled. I know. I appreciate it. They had dinner in the Capitol that evening, the three of them, at a small restaurant that Edmund knew, where the food was plain and the chairs were comfortable, and Soren told a story about a land dispute from his early ranching years that ended with a judge ruling against both parties on a technicality, and both parties having to start the whole process over, which was not the most encouraging story he could have told, but which made Edmund laugh genuinely, and laughter felt like the right thing for that evening. She slept more soundly that night than she had in 12 weeks. The ruling came in 22 days, not 30, another piece of timing that carried information without being entirely interpretable. Edmund sent a telegram first, which arrived at the Red Hollow station on a Tuesday morning, and which Tobin, who had appointed himself an informal courier for anything important reaching Lenora, brought to White Basin at a speed that told her he'd ridden hard. The telegram was 4 words, ruling in your favor. She read standing in the barn doorway, and then she sat down on a hay bale and read it again and held it in her hands. Tobin was watching her with the barely agitation of a 12-year-old who has delivered important news and wants to know the full scope of its importance. "What does it mean?" he asked. "It means we won," she said. He let out a sound that was not quite a word, a released breath, with enthusiasm behind it, and then caught himself performing it and tried to look more composed, which he was not old enough to manage successfully. She found she didn't mind. Edmund's full letter arrived 3 days later, and she read it at the kitchen table with Soren across from her. The judge had found that Crowther Regional Development's pre-registration filing was without legal basis under territorial statutes, as it had purported to register rights over property the company did not own and had no binding agreement to acquire. He had additionally found that the company's documented prior knowledge of the artesian source, combined with the evidence of surveillance of the property, constituted a form of predatory commercial conduct that the territorial legal code did not protect. The filing was voided. The company's claimed interest in the subsurface water rights of White Basin was declared invalid. Lenora Vance's full ownership of the property, including subsurface rights, was affirmed. Crowther Regional Development had 60 days to appeal. Edmund assessed the probability of a successful appeal as low, given the specificity of the judge's findings and the documentary record supporting them. Soren read the letter after her. He set it on the table, and he said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Your father held on to that land for 30 years. He did," she said. "Never knew what was under it." "Not exactly," she said, "but he knew something was." Soren looked at the letter and then looked at the window, at White Basin visible in the November morning light. The drought had broken in October, 3 weeks of rain that had been, as these things always are, both relief and exhaustion, filling the creek beds and muddying the channels and requiring a round of repairs that she and Soren had worked through in cold, wet conditions that were harder on his joints than either of them acknowledged directly. The valley was green again, in the tentative way it gets in late fall, the kind of green that knows winter is coming, but is making the most of the remaining time. The artesian spring was still flowing. It flowed through the rain, and it flowed through the mud, and it would flow through the winter, because it was not a surface thing, and surface conditions could not stop it. He would have been glad, Soren said. She thought about that honestly. Her father had been a complicated man, his silence, his pride, his financial recklessness that had nearly destroyed everything he'd built, and underneath all of that, a genuine love for this land that she had inherited along with its problems. He would have been glad. He would also have been difficult about it, because he'd been difficult about most things. He would have found something to criticize about how long it took. He would have questioned some of her decisions. He would have been proud in the particular way of people who can't say the word directly, so they express it in other ways by telling the story to strangers, by referring to you in their conversations with the specific weight of a parent who is doing the pointing even though they're pointing at you. She thought about him in a way she hadn't allowed herself to since he died, because grief and financial desperation occupied the same psychic space, and she hadn't had room for both, and survival had won the competition for her attention. Now she let herself think about him, and it ached, the way things ache when you press on them that have been left alone too long. "Yeah," she said finally. He would have been glad. The news spread through Red Hollow Valley with the speed that good news travels when it also carries vindication faster than bad news, she thought, because people want to be part of a victory in a way they don't always want to be associated with a defeat. Within a week of the ruling, Lenora had received more visitors to White Basin than she'd had in the entire previous year combined. Some came under the pretense of checking on their cattle's water access. Some came with covered dishes and thin excuses about being in the area. Some came a smaller number, the ones she respected most, and simply said what they had come to say. Beaumont's wife was one of those. A woman in her 60s named Clara, who Lenora had met exactly twice before, came on a Wednesday afternoon with nothing in her hands and said, without preamble, "I heard what people said about you when you bought those cattle. I said some of it myself in private. I want you to know I'm ashamed of that." Lenora stood in the doorway and looked at this woman who had come out here to say a hard thing she hadn't had to say, and she felt the weight of it, what it takes to do that, what it costs, what it says about the person doing it. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I just wanted you to know," Clara said. "That's all." She left, and Lenora stood in the doorway for a moment after the wagon went down the road, and she thought about the specific courage of that, not the large dramatic courage of digging in the dark or standing in front of Crowther's wagon, but the small grinding courage of walking up to someone you've wronged and saying the true thing about yourself. She did not think the whole valley had arrived at that courage. She was not naive enough to think that a legal ruling and a good summer drought had dissolved everything that had been said about her size and her intelligence and her right to be here, doing what she was doing. Some of those people would find different language for the same old thinking. Some would simply move on to the next easy target and leave her alone because she'd become inconvenient to dismiss. That was not transformation. It was just the calculation of self-interest, which was a smaller thing than she might have wanted, but was real and she could work with real. But Clara Beaumont had walked up to her door, and that was something. Custer came on a Saturday, alone as he always came now, and he did not come with covered dishes or thin excuses. He came while she was working the South Channel, and he came out to where she was working, and he picked up the spare tool that was leaning against the channel bank, and he started working the section next to hers. Without being invited and without explaining himself, they worked side by side for about 40 minutes in the way that people who are not yet comfortable with each other can work productively, with a specific task between them that gives the discomfort somewhere to go. Then Kustovitz's windows were dark. Then Custer stopped and straightened and said, "I'm going to say this once, and I won't say it again because I find it difficult, and I don't think you need to hear it more than once." Lenora straightened too. "I was wrong about you," he said, "specifically and particularly wrong, and I said things I had no grounds for, in places where people could hear them." He looked at the channel rather than at her, because he was the kind of man for whom direct eye contact during a difficult admission was one difficulty too many, and she could respect that as a human limitation without requiring him to overcome it. I've been trying to figure out what a person does with that. I don't think there's a clean answer. I think you just do the work differently going forward. She looked at the channel for a moment, at the water moving through it cold and clear, finding its way along the path she and Soren had built by hand over weeks that had cost more than she could fully account for. "The work you're doing right now would have been welcome in April," she said, "when I was hauling stones in the heat with blistered hands." "I know," he said. "But it's welcome now too," she said. He nodded. Once. The same minimal gesture as before, but this one had a different quality, less armored, more honest. They went back to work. She did not tell him she forgave him, because she didn't know yet if that was true, and she had a commitment to not saying things she didn't know were true. What she knew was that he was standing in her channel with a tool in his hands, and that he had found Fielder when she needed Fielder found, and that he had said a hard thing to her face instead of managing the situation from a comfortable distance. Those were facts. Thus, they were not forgiveness, but they were the ground forgiveness might eventually grow from, if the conditions were right and enough time passed. That was how most things grew, she had found. Not all at once, dramatically. Just slowly, given time and the right conditions, in the margins of what had seemed like dead ground. The appeal period ran out in January, without Crowther filing one. Edmund's letter confirming this was brief, just a paragraph, matter of fact. The way you report the ending of something that has been over for a while in all but official terms. He recommended she have the ruling formally recorded at the county recorder's office in Red Hollow, which she did the following week. Hattie Doyle processed the paperwork with the same precise, contained manner she brought to everything, and at the end of it, she stamped the recording and said, without looking up from her ledger, "Congratulations, Miss Vance." "Thank you, Hattie," Lenora said. Hattie looked up then. She had a long face and careful eyes, and she looked at Lenora for a moment, in the way of someone deciding whether to say something. "That survey's been in that cabinet for 36 years, she said. "In all that time, you're the second person to ask for it." Lenora looked at her. "Who was the first?" "Man named Kell," Hattie said. 1889. 2 years after he filed it. Came back to see if anyone had ever acted on it. Lenora thought about Ambrose Kell, the geologist, coming back to a small county recorder's office in 1889 to see if the thing he'd found and written down had done any good. Finding it hadn't. Going away. "Did he say anything?" she asked. Hattie made a small, dry sound. He said the valley was sitting on a fortune and didn't know it. She picked up her pen. Sounds like he was right. Lenora drove back to White Basin in the January cold with the recording document in her jacket pocket, pressed against her ribs the way the telegram had been pressed against her ribs in August. And she thought about Ambrose Kell, and his 1,889 visit, and the 36 years between his question and her answer. And she thought about how long things can wait in the dark before someone's stubborn enough to look finds them. Spring came back to Red Hollow Valley, the way it always did gradually. Then suddenly, the way things that have been building for a long time finally declare themselves. The creeks that had run dry in the drought were running again, higher than usual from the winter rain, and the pastures were showing the tentative green of early grass. And the air had the specific quality it gets in early spring, when the cold hasn't entirely left, but the light has changed and everything knows it. White's Open was green along the channels and around the pond and in the wet margins of the artesian springs influence, and the green was slightly more extensive this year than last because the water had been flowing through the ground for 2 full seasons now, and the soil chemistry was slowly shifting in the places where it had been exposed to consistent moisture. This was a slow process, and Lenora understood it was a slow process. Most of its windows were dark, but she watched the edges of the green and marked where they reached month by month with stakes she drove into the ground because she wanted to know. She wanted to see it happening. Tobin helped with the stakes. He was 13 now, in the particular stage of early adolescence, where boys are neither what they were nor what they will be, all awkward motion and sudden seriousness, and a willingness to work that is partly about proving something to themselves. Most of its windows were dark. He came most days after his schooling, and he worked with the focused attention of someone who has decided that this place and this work are where he wants to be. And Lenora had stopped trying to send him home early because it had never worked, and she had come to rely on him in the quiet way you rely on someone who is simply always there when there is something to be done. One afternoon in late March, driving stakes along the eastern margin of the green zone, he said, without looking up from the stake he was driving, "Do you think they'll try again?" Crowther's company, "Probably not the same approach," she said. "The ruling's too clear. Different approach? Maybe." She drove her stake and moved to the next marked point. Companies like that don't necessarily go away. They recalculate. He was quiet for a moment. "That doesn't bother you?" She thought about it. Honestly, the way she tried to think about everything that mattered. "It bothers me in the way that weather bothers me," she said. "It's there. It's real. It might be a problem. But worrying about it when there's nothing specific to act on is just burning energy I need for other things." He considered this. "That's a useful way to think about it." "I learned it from somebody," she said. He looked up. "Who?" She thought about Soren, who had shown up with hay and a willingness to crouch on hot alkaline ground and press his hands flat and tell her the truth about what he thought he was feeling. She thought about a man who was 71 years old and still willing to dig channels in the heat because seems like this is worth spending it on. "An old man who should probably be sitting on his porch more," she said. Tobin grinned, which was the closest she'd come to a straight smile in a long time, and went back to driving his stake. The first summer of the ruling was quieter than the summer before it quieter, in the way of a situation that has resolved itself rather than the quiet of something holding its breath. The drought did not return with the same severity. The creeks ran low in August, but did not fail. Most of its windows were dark. The ranchers who had been using White Basin through the worst of the previous summer continued to use it at the maintenance rate, because the artesian spring was reliable in a way that no surface water source could be, and reliable had become the most valuable word in the valley's vocabulary. Lenora expanded the channel system that summer, not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally, following the water's natural inclination, downslope, and redirecting it towards sections of the basin that she'd identified as having the best soil recovery potential. Soren helped with the planning. Soren sitting with her over rough maps in the evenings and arguing about angles and gradients with the comfortable bluntness of two people who have stopped performing agreement for each other's benefit. They disagreed about the northeast section specifically over the course of 3 evenings. "The grade's wrong," Soren said. "You'll lose flow pressure before it reaches the end of the channel." "The grade is steeper than it looks," she said. The ground slopes more than the map shows. The map is based on what I walked, he said. I know that ground. You walked it in spring when it was still soft, she said. Compresses in summer. The profile changes. He looked at her. She looked at him. This was how they had been operating for over a year. Now, two people with different experience and different knowledge, arguing toward the best answer rather than toward agreement, which is a more productive kind of argument, and also a harder one, because neither party gets the comfort of being simply right. Drive a stake tomorrow, he said finally. Mark the grade at the northeast corner, and we'll measure it. Fine, she said. She drove the stake. The grade was what she'd said it was. She did not make a production of this. You measured it twice, he said, looking at the stake. I measured it correctly once, she said. The second time was to make sure. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. Build the northeast channel, he said. If it doesn't work, we regrade in fall. It'll work, she said. It worked. The buying back of her father's land began in the second year. The eastern windows were dark, the eastern acreage, the creek frontage, and the productive sections the bank had seized when the debts came had been held by the bank through the drought year and into the following winter. The bank had attempted to sell it twice and found buyers reluctant in a drought year, and then found the market complicated by the general uncertainty that settled over the region while Lenora's legal fight was ongoing, because nobody who understood the situation wanted to buy land in this valley until they knew who controlled the water. When the ruling came through and Lenora's ownership of the White Basin water rights was affirmed, the eastern acreage became more attractive to buyers and also, suddenly, negotiable in ways it had not been before. She approached the bank in January with Edmund's guidance and a documented record of White Basin's value. Most of its windows were dark, and she had a conversation with the bank's regional manager that was nothing like the conversation Pawed had had with her at the kitchen table 2 years earlier. This time, she was not the woman with $42 and failing hope being offered $110 to go away quietly. This time, she was the owner of the most reliable water source in a valley that had recently learned how much that was worth. She paid a fair price. Not a low price. She had not expected a low price, and did not try for one, because she was not trying to exploit her leverage. She was trying to buy her father's land back. There was a difference, and it mattered to her. The transfer was completed in April 2 years and 1 month after Pawed had sat at her kitchen table with his ledger and his uncapped pen. She rode the eastern boundary on the day the recording was formalized, just rode it slowly on her horse, covering ground she had known since childhood. The creek frontage and the slope above it and the long flat section her father had always used for winter hay. Nothing had changed about the land itself. It looked the same as it had always looked, the same as it had looked when the bank took it, and the same as it had looked before that. But it was hers again. And the difference between something being yours and the same thing not being yours is not visible to anyone looking at it from outside. It is entirely interior, a thing that lives in the body, more than in the mind, a weight redistributed, a space reopened. She rode the boundary in the early morning before anyone else was up, alone, because some things need to be done without witnesses. Not because they're private in a secret sense, but because certain moments belong only to the persons inside them, and bringing someone else into the frame changes what the moment is. She wrote it and she thought about her father, who had loved this land in his complicated, inadequate way. She thought about what it had cost him and what it had cost her and what it had cost the 26 cattle that had walked to a cool patch of alkaline ground, because they knew something the rest of them hadn't figured out yet. And she thought about the version of herself that had stood at the kitchen window 8 months earlier, watching Pawed's clean buggy go down the road, and had pressed her palms against the kitchen table, and breathed and refused, in that moment, to accept that the story was already finished. It hadn't been finished. It had barely started. Soren's health began to decline in the third winter. It was not dramatic. He was not that kind of man, and his health was not that kind of health. It was the slow, accumulated declining of a body that has been worked very hard for a very long time and has reached the point where recovery takes longer than it used to. He had a chest cold in November that hung on into December. He moved more carefully than before. He still came to White Basin most days, but he came for shorter periods, and he supervised more and worked less, which she accepted without making him discuss it. One afternoon in February, when the cold was serious and she had brought him coffee in the barn where he was checking the winter state of the retaining wall sections, he said, "I'm not going to be useful to you much longer in the way I have been." She looked at him. He was looking at the wall. "You're useful right now," she said. "Don't," he said, not unkindly, just clear. She was quiet for a moment. "All right." "Tobin knows everything I know about the channels," he said. "I've been showing him since last summer. He's careful and he learns fast." "I know," she said. "I've been watching him learn. He's going to be good," Soren said. "Better than good if he stays." "He'll stay," she said. She was certain of this in the way she was certain of the spring, not because anything guaranteed it, but because she understood the thing she was reading, and she trusted what it told her. Sorens nodded. He drank his coffee. Outside, the February wind pushed against the barn walls with a low, consistent sound. "I want to tell you something," he said. "And I'm not doing it because I think I'm dying tomorrow, or because this is some last words kind of conversation. I'm doing it because I've been thinking about it, and I want to say it while the saying is easy." She waited. "What you did here," he said, "with this land and this water and these people, what you did is rare. I've been in this valley a long time, and I've watched a lot of people make a lot of decisions, and most people, when they have power that they earned by suffering, use it the way they were used. They make sure everyone knows what they're owed." He paused. "You didn't do that. You opened the basin. You charged fair rates. When Custer came to you with his 200 dying head, after everything he'd said, you told him to come in and you showed him the channels." He looked at her. "That's not common." She looked at the coffee in her hands. "It wasn't entirely noble," she said honestly. "Some of it was practical. A valley full of people who owed you something is more useful than a valley full of people who resent you." "Maybe," he said. "But you thought about what desperation felt like, and you didn't want to be the reason someone else felt it. You told Aldrich that the first week." She remembered saying it. She remembered meaning it. "I don't know how to be a different kind of person," she said. "I know what it's like to need something and have nobody extend the hand. Can't make that the way I operate. It doesn't fit." Sorens looked at her for a long moment. "That's what I mean," he said. "That's the rare part." He finished his coffee and handed back the cup and went to look at the last section of the wall. And she stood in the barn, holding the empty cup, and felt the weight of what he'd said and tried to figure out what to do with it. Because she was not someone who received praise easily or well, and she suspected that this was not going to get better with age. She decided in the end to just let it sit where he'd put it. The spring flowing was the last thing she thought about on the nights when sleep was slow coming, not as a worry, not anymore, but as a kind of anchor. It was there, below the limestone and the clay, and the alkaline crust that everyone had called worthless, moving upward with the tireless pressure of water that had been finding its way for longer than any living thing in that valley could account for. It would be there in the morning and the morning after that. It had been patient in ways that human patience could not touch, and it had waited for someone stubborn enough and trusting enough to stop listening to the surface and start digging. Lenora Vance, at 27, had been a heavy-set woman alone on dead land, with 42 tesses and 26 starving cattle that everyone believed were worthless. At 32, she ran the largest operation in Red Hollow Valley, owned every acre her father had ever touched, and was asked by the Territorial Water Board to serve as an advisor on artesian resource development, a role she accepted. Because Edmund told her it would make her position legally unassailable for the next decade, and also because she genuinely thought she could be useful. And those two reasons together were good enough. She never moved differently to accommodate what people thought about her body. She worked the same way she had always worked, hauling, digging, carrying, climbing, and her body did that work the same way it had always done it, which was adequately, with effort, leaving marks. She had blisters and she had calluses, and she had the specific ache in her lower back that was the permanent record of 2 weeks digging in a basin in the heat, and she considered all of these the correct price of what she had built. Tobin grew up working beside her and became the kind of man who knows cattle and water and soil with the specificity that only comes from years of close attention, and he brought those years to White Basin with a dedication that was not obligation. He had options, by then. Other places he could have gone but choice, which meant more. Soren died on a Thursday in April, 5 years after the spring was found, on a morning when the basin was green and the cattle were moving in the early light and the artesian spring was flowing, as it always was, as it would continue to be. He died in his own bed, on his own property, which was what he would have wanted, and Lenora sat with him the day before, and they talked about ordinary things and some things that weren't ordinary, and she held his hand, which was something she had never done, and which he accepted without comment, because they had, over 5 years, moved past the need to explain themselves to each other. She built Zinsel. She built a proper stock pond in his name, the following summer larger than the original, with channels that reached farther into the basin than before. She didn't put a sign on it. The people who knew why it was there knew, and the people who didn't would ask someone who did, and that was how memory moved in small places, from person to person, which was slow but durable. The spring kept flowing through all of it. Through the legal fight and the rulings and the buying back of the land and the expansion of the channels and the death of an old man who had chosen with the time and strength he had remaining to spend it on something worth spending it on. It flowed through summers and winters and springs and would flow through summers and winters and springs that none of them would live to see. Some things do not require you to understand them in order to trust them. 26 cattle had known that before any of the humans did, and one woman had been stubborn enough and tired enough of being told what was impossible to follow where they led. That was the whole story, or as much of it as can be told, which is never quite the whole thing, because the rest of it is still down there in the dark, patient and pressurized, waiting for the next person stubborn enough to dig.